parties, we're going to shift from our housekeeping session. It's now 9:03, so we're just a few minutes behind. And our first order of business today, I think, is to pause, formally open the hearing, and welcome those that are joining us for the 6th day of the Horse Heaven Wind Farm adjudication. Tonight is going to be the public comment hearing starting at 5:30. So the goal today is to be done by around 2:30, maybe 2:45 is where the schedule goes to. Our order of business today, after the roll call for council, I'm going to ask council members again today to check in on any ex parte contacts they want to put on the record, if any. Then we'll take Karen or Catherine, I'm not sure if I got it right, between what's in the list and what I saw on the screen today. Ms. Campbell's testimony will be adopted, and then we'll come to Mr. Wiley, who's been recalled, and go on from there. So I'll ask staff to call the roll of the council, and then I'll formally call the roll of the parties.
FSEC Chair.
Kathleen Drew, present.
Department of Commerce.
Elizabeth Osborne, present.
Department of Ecology.
Eli Levitt, present.
Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Mike Livingston, present.
Department of Natural Resources.
Lenny Young,
Utilities.
present.
Thank you. Utilities and Transportation Commission.
Stacy Brewster, present.
For the Horse Heaven Project, Department of Agriculture. And Benton County.
Ed Rose, present.
All right, thank you. Council members, as I've asked periodically during the course of the hearing, does any council member have an ex parte contact they may have had since the last time I asked that needs to be put on the record? All right, again, I'm not seeing any, so you must be staying close to your offices and away from the phones. Let me turn to the parties then, and for the record today, who's on for the applicant?
Thank you, Your Honor. Tim McMahon from Stoll Reeves here with Willow Perlmutter, Emily Schimmelfennig, and Ariel Stavitsky.
Thank you, Mr. McMahon. For the county today.
Good morning, Your Honor. Ken Harper with Z Foster.
And counsel for the environment.
Sarah Reinefeld here for Council for the Environment, Your Honor.
And for the Yakima Nation.
Good morning, Your Honor, and ASEC Council, Shona Volkers for the Yakima Nation. I do have a member of my team that will be stepping out for part of the morning, but we are ready to proceed. All
right, so you have Mr. Jones. Are you on your own for the morning?
I'd have to look at the exact list, Your Honor, but Mr. Jones and Ms. Houston will be joining for the majority of this morning session. They do have a little bit of conflicts right off the bat, but we are ready to proceed, Your Honor.
Okay, fantastic. And for TCC.
Good morning, council members. Rick Aramburu here today representing Tri-City Cares.
All right, we're going to get to our first witness, and that is going to be Ms. Campbell. I'm going to get her testimony up on my screen. I believe it's 5800 and 5801. And as I'm reading that, it's Karen Campbell. Is that correct?
It's Corinne.
Corinne.
Yeah.
We're just going to shuffle some tiles on the screen so I can actually see you, Ms. Campbell.
Okay.
Oh, she doesn't have her camera on.
There we go.
Thank you very much. All right, Ms. Campbell, good morning. I'm Judge Torum. We're going to swear you in and just have you adopt both exhibits 5800 and 5801. And my reading of this was your position on running the winery there, as well as concerns with fire support that might be available or not based on the height of the turbines. And the pictures were at 5801. So for the council members, once I swear her in, we'll see if you have any questions. No other party, Ms. Campbell, from the ones you heard me take the roll, had prepared any questions or at reserved time. So if you'll raise your right hand, do you, Corinne Campbell, solemnly swear or affirm that all of the testimony contained in pre-filed exhibits 5800 and 5801 will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
All right, and I take it that's the same for any answers you provide to the council. Chair Drew and council members, any questions for Ms. Campbell?
May I have just a preliminary question for the witness, Your Honor?
Certainly, Mr. Rambrew.
Ms. Campbell, good morning. In your testimony, your address is noted as 19205 North McBee Road, Northwest in Benton City, Washington. And could you just orient the members of the board as to where that actually is? And I'm going to do a little leading testimony here. We've got a number of maps, and on those maps there is a Benton City is indicated, and the interchange with I-82 is indicated. And I recall that the Anilary Winery is about a mile north of that interchange. Am I right about that?
Your
Yes.
Honor, I'm sorry to interrupt here, but for the record, there was no identification proposed for direct testimony from this witness this morning. None of the parties considered cross-examination, and this is, in fact, frankly, kind of surprise testimony that is, in fact, going to get in the way of progressing through the proceedings. So we do object to this line of questioning.
Thanks, Mr. McMahon. I'm going to give Mr. Aramburu some latitude just to give us a geographical picture of where the Anilary Winery is located. And I trust he's going to move on quickly to see if the council has questions, because that is the purpose of this session, Mr. Aramburu.
Just wanting to alert the council members where the Anilary Winery is. Was my description accurate, Ms. Campbell?
Yes, so I'm located on the McBee hillside, and my home and business face directly back at Red Mountain.
Okay. Let's.
Okay.
I just want to orient where you are. So you are about a mile north of the I-82 interchange in Benton City.
Correct.
Excuse me, south. Am I correct?
Sorry, yeah, we're south. Yeah.
Okay, is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
For the geographic orientation. Chair Drew, any questions that you might have about the fire issues and the winery's viewscape issues? All right, I'm seeing none. Council members, if you raise your electronic hands, I'll be able to see if you have any questions for Ms. Campbell. All right, Ms. Campbell, I'm not seeing any, but I trust over the course of looking at maps, we'll be able to actually see exactly where your home and business is located as those are reviewed by the council members. Thank you for being here this morning. I appreciate it very much.
No problem.
All
Thank you,
right.
Frank.
We're going to move on then to Christopher Wiley, who's been recalled for a limited number of questions from Chair Drew, and we'll see if that results in hopefully any very limited recross or redirect questions. So I'm going to see if Mr. Wiley is in the hearing. I see. Mr. Wiley,
Hello.
good morning. Nice
Good
to
morning.
see you again. Let me give you an oath of witness one more time, and then I'm sure that somebody's indicated to you exactly the scope of what Chair Drew wants to ask about. So I'll have you just take the oath again. Do you, Chris Wiley, solemnly swear or affirm that all testimony you'll provide in the course of today's hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Chair Drew. And I've asked to make sure, Chair Drew, if you need it, that Exhibit 1035R is available to be put up on the screen in case you need to go there.
Thank you, Your Honor. Welcome, Mr. Wiley. To just set the parameters, I'd like to just repeat that specifically in your testimony, and we don't have to bring it up, I'm just stating it for the record, that we're looking at page 5, lines 3 through 18, and page 8, line 8 to page 10, line 25. And I have 3 pretty general questions, maybe 4 because one's a follow-up. And the first is, do you think the Horse Heaven Wind Farm project is compatible with dryland wheat farming?
But before I answer your first question, I was wondering if I could clarify my personal connection to the project. I believe Mr. McMahon was going to add something here.
Mr. Wiley, I think, yes, I was just going to indicate that, that there is a Wiley family farm and that Chris himself has acquired his own property through lease for his own farming operations. And I think Mr. Wiley is in the best position to explain how the Wiley family farm interacts with Mr. Wiley's leased lands to paint the most accurate picture on how these enterprises work together. And he's, you know, far better than I to continue talking about this. So I'm just going to turn this back to Chris. So Chris,
Okay.
you go ahead.
I just wanted
Appreciate
to
the
clarify.
context. Mr. Wiley, I want to make sure, Chair Drew, did you want him to go into those things just so we can understand the basis foundation for his dryland wheat
Yes.
farming opinions? All right, so
Yes.
Mr. Wiley, go ahead and set us the scene.
Okay, so I wanted to clarify on this because it can be confusing when there's multiple entities in the picture. So Wiley Ranches is my family farm that's been in my family since the 1940s, located in the Horse Heaven Hills. In addition to that, I have recently taken on a lease from another neighbor in the community. And so I have my own LLC operation where I'm farming on my own, that's separate, but my LLC, since I'm leasing farmland from a neighbor, I don't have a lease with Scout. My family does with the family farm. With that being said, I do a majority of the labor for both farm operations because of some health considerations of my father. He just can't sit in a tractor like like he used to when he was younger. So the farm is set up to where I can make, on a day-to-day basis, I need to be prepared for either my dad being available or him not being available. So on a day-to-day basis, I'm I can make decisions for both operations.
Thank you. Okay, that's helpful to understand that that situation. So we can go then to the first question, if that's okay with you. Okay.
Yes,
Do you think the Horse Heaven Wind Farm project is compatible with dryland wheat farming?
absolutely. I think that the project is compatible with dryland wheat farming. And I think the best way to analyze this is to first give a little brief on dryland wheat farming in the Horse Heaven Hills, because although wheat is grown around the world, farming in the Horse Heaven Hills is very unique, and it'll help paint a better picture. So the main reason farming here is different is because of how little precipitation we get. We get 6 to 8 inches of annual precipitation, and maybe that number sounds arbitrary. So to put it in perspective, in eastern Washington, the Palouse, which is the highest wheat producing region in the world, gets 25 inches of annual precipitation. Seattle gets 40 inches of annual precipitation. The continental US as a whole receives 30 inches of precipitation on average. And fun fact, deserts around the world receive 10 inches of precipitation on average. We get 6 to 8 inches. This is the driest place in the world that wheat is produced without irrigation. So because of the limited precipitation, we only harvest our land every other year. In other cropping systems, you might rotate through different crops, but usually there isn't a period where the land is just sitting fallow. But that's as intense of an operation as we can do without depleting the land. And so some other characteristics are that because of the low precipitation, our soils are very arid. Organic matter is usually 1% or less than 1% organic matter, where prime farmland is usually considered to have 3 to 5% organic matter. And this is crucial for water holding capacity, nutrient holding capacity, and also just the structure of the soil. If you don't have organic matter there's nothing to bind the soil and keep it in place. So because of that, our soils are very vulnerable to wind and water erosion. And that's also due to their parent material. They're sandy and silt in nature. There isn't any clay content to our soils. So Yeah, according to the NRCS, our land is classified as highly erodible lands, also known as hell. So welcome to the Horse Heaven Hills, which is classified as hell to the government. So with that being said, I'd like to explain why our particular system is so compatible with dryland wheat. And a lot of it is because our operation has to be large in size to make up for this low rainfall and this low production. Excuse me. So working with Scout, only a very small percent of our acreage will be taken out of production by the wind turbines. And this is also including for the maintenance roads that will be built with the turbines. Dave Kobus, according to him, 1 acre or less of ag land would be taken out of production per turbine installed. So I ran the numbers for Wiley Ranches based on the maximum number of turbines that could be installed on Wiley Ranches property. And I came up with over 99% of our farmland will continue to be normal operating farmland after the construction of the project. This doesn't account for the fact that the service roads that are being built for the project also serve as service roads for the farmers. It's not just a benefit to Scout. So the best way I could clarify this is that when operating a combine harvester in our long fields that are sometimes a mile or more in length, there is a limited distance that you can travel out into the field and back to the road before the bulk tank and the combine is full. So on a higher than average production year, let's say we're harvesting 40 bushels an acre, with the equipment we have, you can't reach the back of the field and make it back to the road with that crop. You'll overflow the bulk tank on the combine. So you have to come up with other creative ways to get that crop out of the field. That's where grain carts and other equipment come into play, but that also means more operators and more labor costs, which is, frankly, we're kind of a 1 to 2 man band here on Wiley Ranches, so we don't have the luxury of bringing on additional labor. So with that being said, these maintenance roads, although they would divide up the property in a sense, they also give us better access to our own land. A lot of these fields only have county road access on one side, and the rest is landlocked. Not to mention, this also gives us better chances to control wildfire in the area with this road access. And we're hauling very expensive farm equipment currently down dirt trails. They get rutted and washed out. Having a gravel field road is a luxury. Most farmers on the Horse Heaven Hills would consider that a luxury that most of us don't have at this point. So with that being said, some of the lost acreage that I've accounted for isn't really lost acreage in my mind. So I would also like to talk about some of Benton County's points they made as to why they believe this project is not compatible. Because I disagree with their viewpoints on this. Mr. Harper on last Monday, he kept emphasizing that although about 6,000 acres would be taken out of production, the total scope of the project was over 100 square miles. To put that in perspective, the Tri-Cities community itself is approximately 109 square miles of developed land that was previously farmland and wildlife habitat. So that just kind of gives you a scope for the size he's talking about. But the point I'm making is that by spreading the Scout project out over this much leased acreage reduces the impact of the operation. It does not increase it, because most of the farmland in this project is still operating as normal. The individual landowners have a reduced impact by keeping the concentration of turbines spread out. Another point the county made was that 1% of Benton County's ag land would be removed from production by the project. But this was comparing acres to acres. This was not comparing dollar amounts. So according to the 2017 census, this information was found on the National Agricultural Statistics Survey website. In 2017, Benton County's gross ag production was $1,005,288,000. That was gross production across Benton County ag, and that production took place over 613,000 acres. So if you divide the math out there, Benton County's average gross production in ag is $1,638 per acre. Dryland wheat, let's say on average we produce 35 bushels of wheat a year. Let's be generous, round it up to 40. The price of wheat right now is $7 a bushel. So that comes out to around $300 per acre per crop. We produce a crop once every 2 years. So you have to divide that number in half. So approximately, we're looking at $150 per acre on average gross production. This is less than a tenth of the county's average for agricultural production. So to claim that the monetary impact from this project would be much greater than 1% isn't based on any fact. And the fact is it would be much smaller than 1% when you're talking dollars and not direct acres. Another claim from Ms. Cook's testimony was the negative impacts this project would have on Benton County's ag support economy. And I would like to argue that Benton County doesn't have an ag support economy directed towards dryland wheat. I can think of one business in Benton County that caters towards dryland wheat production. That's the McGregor Company that sells fertilizer, pesticides, seed, and agronomic services. Other than that, every business that Horse Heaven farmers do business with to produce their crop are located in Franklin County, Yakima County, or Umatilla County, Oregon, or even farther away. There isn't a dryland wheat ag support economy of significance in Benton County. Furthermore, the wheat produced in Benton County is all sold in export markets internationally. Asia is the primary destination of dryland wheat produced in the Pacific Northwest. So the money produced in our region from dryland wheat is not money that stays in Benton County. As far as the county is concerned, it would not matter if all of the dryland acres in the Horse Heaven Hills were taken out of production and put into CRP grass. The property taxes the county would receive would be exactly the same. Lastly,
Take me off.
I would
Mr.
like to
Weiland,
clear.
I want you
Yes.
to wrap up because at some point, one of the lawyers is going to object that this is literally a narrative. I'm giving you some latitude because the chairs asked this question, but also it helps flesh these things out point by point. What I'm trying to make sure is that we just get your personal opinions on compatibility and just wrap that up. And then Chair Drew's got just some very narrow questions. So let's keep the next answers to those questions as short as possible for this. So I appreciate all that you're sharing, and as not only an individual, as a farmer, but a leaseholder and working with family. But some of the numbers you're getting into, I honestly, I'll be instructing the council that as much as you know the land better than we do, you haven't been qualified as an expert in these things as a county, thing. So I know I'm taking you as a personal and very emphatic owner of and farmer of the land. But again, it's more a question of expertise and foundation. We have some evidence rules that don't overlap always with farming rules. I'll just put it that way. So make your
Okay.
last point and then I'll get back to Chair Drew.
Okay, yeah. All these numbers are public information, by the way. But so yeah, the last point I would like to make, that's my opinion, is that the Horse Heaven Hills farmland is under threat from urban expansion from the Tri-Cities. That is the biggest threat in terms of what would take our land out of farm production. By receiving by working with Scout and receiving lease payments, it incentivizes us to hold on to our farmland and to continue farming for years to come. Yeah, that's the point I'd like to make.
Thank you. The next question is, what are the impacts on local Horse Heaven Hill? I added that, dryland wheat farmers not participating in the project.
Okay.
From your opinion.
I would say that the impacts of this project on community members who are not participating is extremely minimal, considering that no changes are actually being made to their farmland. The biggest impact that I can think of is that they will visually see the turbines. Does this affect their farming operation? I don't believe so. It's about the same as saying that the turbines will be visible from Tri-Cities, the adjacent community. It doesn't actually affect their operations. It's not located on their property. The only other potential impact that I could think of was brought up by Mr. Arambaru last week, and he was talking about the traffic issue with more vehicles being on the roadway. And I believe he was talking about 200,000 gallons of water being hauled in daily for the construction of the project. That comes out to 30, 35 truckloads of water a day. That is insignificant compared to the agricultural related traffic on our roadways currently. When you think of all the acreage up here being harvested, not just the dryland wheat, but farther south towards the Columbia River where irrigation is taking place, there's massive amounts, onion, corn, potatoes, carrots. There's a lot of traffic on our roadways already.
Thank you.
Yeah, those are the two.
And I think you already touched on this question, so I don't know if you need to go any further, but what future do you see for dryland agriculture in the Horse Heaven Hills with the project and without the project? And you already touched on that a little bit.
Yeah. So I guess let's start with if the project doesn't come to fruition. The future I see is a continuation of the trends that have been going on in our area for the last 100+ years. And that is a consolidation of farmland ownership. Small farms have gone broke and sold to large farms. And it's kind of sad from a community perspective that sometimes your neighbors aren't in production anymore. And even on Wiley ranches, we farm land that was in one point or another owned by somebody else, somebody my grandfather considered dear friends. And so I see this trend continuing in the future. And as farmland is consolidated in ownership, there's a point where you pass economy of scale and you enter into where efficiency on the farm goes down because these operations get so big, and attention to detail and care for the individual pieces of land goes down. And from a community perspective, there's a story on each 160-acre homestead up here. And as those pieces are lost in big farms, that story is lost to time. So I also see that on the perimeters of the Horse Heaven Hills, farmland will continue to be sold for housing because of the monetary incentive to do so. And when you really have to be farming this land out of the love of it in your heart. You really have to love to be here to make this work, and not everyone wants to do that. So when so I see some farmland being lost permanently on the verges of the area as well. Now my future that I see with Scout, I see the farmers in the region reinvesting the lease money with Scout, reinvesting that into their farm operations in an attempt to make them thrive. I envision an a miniature agricultural renaissance, so to speak, like the Green Revolution that took place in the Pacific Northwest in the 1950s. I would like to speak here just for my family's plan with what we would do with working with Scout. The number one part of the plan is just survival, to right the ship, so to speak, to eliminate existing debts, to properly compensate the members of the family working on the farm. The next step would be to upgrade our equipment and our facilities into the 21st century. We are working with extremely outdated equipment here. Our grain storage facility was built in 1962 by my great grandfather. It is not operational at this time. It is dilapidated into a point of it'd be unsafe to use. And having a grain storage facility it used to be considered a big market advantage to be able to home store your crops and sell them at a time when the market's peaked. That was a big advantage that we no longer have due to dilapidating facilities. Our mechanic shop, where I spend most of my winter months working on all this old equipment, is just an old 1972 and a 1975 Chevy 2-ton truck. One of them's on its second engine. The other one's on its third. We just piece these things together every year to keep them operating. Our tractors, a 1989 and a 1993 John Deere 8760 with over 15,000 engine hours on each of them. That's the equivalent of relying on a car every day with over 500,000 miles on it. It's like rolling the dice every day, hoping things work out. So if you want a visual perspective of what we plan on doing with working with Scout, it's pretty apparent to me. It's simple stuff at this point that we need to fix. And then after all that is taken care of, the plan is to invest in new ag technologies, which are coming out all the time, that could help us maximize our production and increase farm efficiency and reduce input costs. The most advanced technology we have is we retrofitted our tractors to run a GPS line. So it in a sense, it steers itself through the field. That reduces overlap and helps with efficiency. But there's much more technologies out there. You can variable rate fertilizer applications and seed applications. There's weed control technologies where you only apply herbicide directly onto the weeds in the field. The sprayer actually has the ability to sense where biomass is and target those. So you're looking at a reduction of chemical inputs by over 50% using that technology, which is one, a cost, but an environmental concern as well. So yeah, you want to talk about our plan for the future? I could keep going if you want me to.
Thank
I could spend
you.
all day talking about this.
I hear that. So thank you, and thank you for your enthusiasm as well for what you do.
I would like to, if you have time, I would like to share one more thing. This is a poem written by my great grandmother about the Horse Heaven Hills, her first time moving here in the 1940s. We came up Badger Canyon Road, a truck with tractor, a heavy load. We reached the top and saw such a sight, could hardly believe we were seeing right. The air was dusty, the sky was gray. It was snowing dirt that day. I turned around to my infant son and said, "What in the world has your father done?" But the springtime came and the wheat fields grew. I saw I had such a spectacular view. As far away as my eyes could see, what a marvelous vista opened for me. Of course, we had winds that were sometimes fearful, and the farmers complained they gave you an earful. But those of us who love these hills, though it's hard at times to pay the bills, know we are lucky just to be here, the grandest place in the stratosphere. I've seen my trees grow very tall, and my children and grands both large and small, and always I've lived in the hills that are magical, appealing, appalling, rewarding, and tragical. So when my time comes, as I know it must, when ashes are ashes and dust is dust, I would like to lie in the hills I love, till called by the master of all from above, Doris J. Wiley. Thank you.
Thank you.
Your Honor, Tim McMahon here, if I might, could we just ask for Mr. Wiley's educational background? I was remiss not to do that when we started.
Certainly, and I don't think that's part of his pre-filed testimony. So if you give us a quick summary, Mr. Wiley.
Yeah, I attended high school at Prosser High School, class of 2014. I was the valedictorian of my class. I attended Washington State University from 2014 to 2019. I graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Integrated Plant Systems, majoring in field crop management. And farmers are students every day. My education continues on a daily basis, and I like to absorb facts. So that's my education background.
Thank you, Mr. Wiley. Other council members, based on Chair Drew's questions and the rather expositive answers we got from Mr. Wiley, any questions you might have? All right, I'm not seeing any, so I think, Mr. Wiley, you answered all the questions they might have as well. Mr. Harper, I think it's only fair to see, besides calling Ms. Cook, if you have any other questions you wanted to flesh out with Mr. Wiley.
No, no questions.
All right, thank you. Any other parties have anything they wanted to ask of Mr. Wiley?
I do.
Mr. Ramber.
So, Mr. Wiley, my family on my mother's side came to Whitman County in the 1850s and 1860s and have been farmers over there enjoying the extra precipitation that we get in Whitman as opposed to Benton County. Just one question. You were talking about the combines and emptying the combines. Don't the trucks drive into the field?
For the most part, back in the day when we ran a fleet of 2-ton trucks and you had drivers that were in some way related to the farm operation, yeah, you could drive these small trucks out in the field. But with semi trucks, that now a lot of times we contract truck drivers to haul our grain directly from the field to a co-op grain elevator. They don't want to drive out in the field. It's you're driving on sand basically. You're prone to getting stuck. They might, I mean, depending on the driver, they might accommodate you a little bit, but they're not going to drive a half mile out into the field. It's more of the farmer's responsibility to get the grain to them.
So, Mr. Wiley, I just kind of looked up some of the things you've been doing. I see you've been on TV, and I think, didn't you write an editorial for the Tri-City Herald on this subject?
I wrote an editorial article, has it been 3 years ago now? I didn't know how to publish it in a sense. I posted it on my Facebook, and it was picked up by the Tri-City Herald, the Seattle Times, I believe Capital Press. Yeah. So, yeah, that's correct.
So you've been on TV as well, correct?
Yes, I've also done a TV interview with, I believe it was KNDU, the Tri-Cities local station.
But isn't it the case, I've been listening to your testimony here, but isn't the case that the primary issue here is getting more money? Isn't that right?
The primary issue is getting more money?
Yes.
The primary issue here is keeping our family's lands in our family for the extended future, for the foreseeable future, and taking the steps necessary to do so.
That involves having more money, doesn't it?
It involves having a working capital basis. Yes, you can't farm without money is my general understanding.
Okay, and your family has signed a lease with Scout, is that correct?
The landowners of this project, one of which is the entity Wiley Ranches. Yes, all the landowners up here involved with the project have signed leases.
So Wiley Ranches has a lease. How about the property you are leasing for Bubba Wheat, I think is the name of your LLC. Does that property have a lease with Scout?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And are those two leases the same?
What two leases the same?
The lease for the property that you're leasing and the Wiley Ranches lease, are they the same?
I'm not capable of talking about the terms of our leases, and frankly, that's none of your business.
Yeah. Objection withdrawn.
Yeah, Mr. Ramber, I think we went into this that we weren't going to try to get into specific financial dollars. I think it's obvious that the leases pay money. We're not going into how much. Those are private materials. So any other questions from Mr. Wiley?
I do want to pose my strong objection. This witness's testimony today was all about getting money for this and money for that and money for the other thing. Now, he's the one that's bringing this up. It wasn't really Ms. Drew's question, but so I think he has interjected this into the proceedings. I do think it's appropriate to have this information, since he's brought it up. He's relying on these materials. So I think it's appropriate for us to have a copy of the lease and just see what the situation is.
Not happening. Next question.
Would you like my social security number as well?
No, Mr. Wiley, you don't need to respond unless there's a question posed. So let's just throttle back.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. No further questions.
Perfect. Show of hands. Anybody need to ask a question? Ms. Volkers.
Thank you, Your Honor. I did want to make sure that I understand one of the things that Mr. Relly said at the end of his testimony in order to try to weigh it. So I understand that you talked a lot or you gave helpful detail about how your family might use these funds. But I think you also talked about generally how you see the Horse Heaven Hills as a farming community moving forward with or without the project. And so my question is your testimony today that somehow the totality of the lease payments to the local farmers is necessary to maintain dryland farming in the Horse Heaven Hills?
I guess I should clarify that with or without the project, the farmers of the Horse Heaven Hills are adamant about keeping these farms in our family and doing so as long as possible. We've been through incredible hardships over the years and persevered, and we will continue to do so as long as we can. The point I was trying to make is that the east end of the Horse Heaven Hills, which is the end that borders the Tri-Cities community, is also the area where this project would be taking place. This is the area that is more prone to the bleeding of the GMAAD to land leaving it for urban purposes. And so this project would help stop the bleeding, and it would help, that's the word I guess I would say, keep these lands in farming families.
So it would help keep the lands in the ag designation then. That's the goal that I'm hearing. Is that correct? That's the goal of the community, is to keep these lands in ag designation?
Absolutely, yes.
And so if there were other funding sources to help, that goal could still be met. It's not, the project's not the only option for the community, to the farmers themselves. I'm not talking about the county's options to protect the land, but the farmers. There might be other ways for any family to maintain their legacy. But it's not your testimony, Dave, that this project itself is necessary through lease payments to maintain that farming activity, correct?
So I would say that our farming practices on the Horse Heaven Hills have, in a sense, hit a plateau in terms of advancement. Wheat varieties that are developed by a lot of it is developed by WSU or other. There's some private breeding entities in the area too. They don't really focus on our dryland region for producing crops that thrive here. So we're kind of limited with what we can work with in terms of our ag system. We've employed practices that help reduce erosion and reduce tillage. We are always looking into the future, and this is the only change that we currently see that we could make to our production that would add value to our production. At this point in time, this is the thing we see that is going to best help us keep our land as farmland in our families for generations to come.
Okay, and when you say us, you mean your family, or do you mean that the community as a whole? Because I'm just grappling with, we don't have any other leaseholders speaking out in favor of the project on this adjudication. So if you're speaking for the community, I would be asking, for the foundation of that opinion.
Yeah,
and
so
I don't mean to demean, I'm not trying to demean your family's personal goals here. I'm just trying to understand kind of when you say we, who you're speaking on behalf of and how that's supported in the record.
Yeah. So I apologize. It's hard for me to differentiate between the two at times when I'm speaking, because I've lived here my whole life, and our neighbors up here that farm alongside us are our friends. And so, yeah, at times I do find myself speaking on their behalf. In terms of this, perhaps I just have the credibility to speak on behalf of my family and our farm operation. But if you reached out to other landowners, which I'd like to point out Benton County never did, they would all share the same sentiment that I'm sharing with you.
Those are my questions. Thank you, Your Honor. And I do apologize, Mr. Riley, I didn't introduce myself. I think you've been watching, but I am the attorney for the Akron Nation, so I appreciate you answering the questions. Thank you.
Yeah, it was nice to meet you.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Wiley. I appreciate it. I'm sure you'll stay on. If you'll mute your microphone, that'd be fantastic. We'll get on to our next witness. I see Ms. Cook on my screen.
Thank you.
Good morning, Ms.
Honor.
Cook. Welcome back.
Thank you.
I'm going to swear you in very quickly to see what additional questions Mr. Harper might have for you, and just go on from there. So Michelle Cook, if you'll raise your right hand, do you solemnly swear or affirm that all the testimony you'll provide this morning will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
All right, and I think your testimony was Exhibit 2003T. If anybody wants to pull that up as they follow along. Mr. Harper, floor is yours.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ms. Cook, you've had a chance to review Chair Drew's questions that were circulated last Friday, correct?
I have.
Okay. And Ms. Cook, were you also able to listen to the testimony of Mr. Wiley?
I did.
Okay. What I'd like to do then, with the brief time that we have allotted to this, Ms. Cook, is provide, if you will, Chair Drew and the FSEC Council, your perspective as a planner regarding, I guess, how the testimony we've heard from Mr. Wiley fits into the planner's perspective and the conditional use permit compatibility considerations that are actually before the council.
Of course. Mr. Wiley gave us a very great background of his family's experience as wheat farmers up there. We heard him speak a lot about financial gain and income streams from this project. Unfortunately, the economics, income, and the utilization of people's money isn't a criteria that we evaluate on the planning level of how compatible a certain use is with the zoning designation. So in this project, although maybe economics is a consideration for some, it's not a consideration necessarily of the county when we're evaluating how we can protect agricultural lands of long-term commercial significance, just because economic gain in the short term doesn't necessarily equate to what is going to protect in the long term. So because one generation may benefit financially doesn't mean that the landscape will benefit for generations and generations to come. And so that's something that we remove out of our criteria for evaluation.
Ms. Cook, let me ask you a follow-up to that. One of Chair Drew's questions is a matter of compatibility between, I guess, well, let me rephrase that. One of her questions is kind of stemming from compatibility, but it's actually a question that has more to do with the relationship between the landscape as a whole. She asks, what about local dryland wheat farmers not participating in the project? Can you speak to that? I mean, what do you think as a planner may be a likely consequence of this this introduction of a non-agricultural income stream in sort of sporadic parts of the Horse Heaven area?
I think two things come to mind. First would be the fragmentation of the land as far as those who are currently continuing their normal farming operations and those who have or are within the project lease area and have this infrastructure built on their property. I think that fragmentation would lead to the disruption of the family legacy that Mr. Wiley touched on so clearly. I think that bringing leases onto a landscape that hasn't had these other types of use would potentially mean that, as Mr. Wiley spoke to, that the disinvestment of the monies into the lease project area or the region in general, and looking at land ownership alone of the 40 potential leasees, 9 of them are the only ones who live within the lease project boundary area. The others live either in town in the urban cities or not even in the region. They may be on the west side or they're LLCs. So considering that only a few of those folks actually live, as Mr. Wiley and his family do, on the property and farm it on a day-to-day basis, I wouldn't think that they would have the same stewardship and practices to continue that legacy of farming as Mr. Wiley's family does. So I don't know that he's a typical representation of the owners of the properties who are signing these leases. And I feel like this fragmentation would be easy pickings for other large investment corporations such as the Bill Gates and the Mormon churches who look actively to buy agricultural land, because as Mr. Wiley said in his written testimony, there's no agricultural land, no new agricultural land being produced. We only have a limited amount. So protecting those, and as Mr. Wiley spoke to, keeping those in a regional family effort is of utmost importance. And these leases are just going to completely disrupt that. Secondly, I also think the leases are going to bring economic competition, in my opinion, unhealthy economic competition between a very tight-knit community. So while one farmer may be receiving the supplemental income to be able to buy new implements and have cutting-edge practices, the neighbor next door maybe didn't get a lease with Scout, and they will be at a disadvantage from being able to compete on the market without that extra income flow. So I think it'll lead to also the fragmentation of the community and social network in this very small and intimate area that Scout is proposed to go into.
Ms. Cook, from a planning perspective, is the county focused on the long-term best interest and the long-term preservation of the agricultural characteristics of the Horse Heaven Hills?
We are. That is the main priority of the zoning designation and the land use designation that the Horse Heaven Hills comprises. I know Mr. Wiley spoke to the encroachment of urbanization and residential pressure, but unfortunately, from a planning standpoint, that's just not true because we have lost 0 acres to urbanization, 0 GMA agricultural acres to urbanization. It's flat out not allowed in this zone. So therefore we protect it because the state mandates that we protect from these pressures or other pressures such as industrial uses or other non-compatible uses. So in the future, without the wind farm project going in, I strongly believe that this area will never be urbanized because it is not allowed to be urbanized from state mandate unless something changes at the state level to allow this ground to open up to different uses. I foresee it continuing to be in agricultural operations of one way or another into the future.
Yeah, Ms. Cook, you're the planning manager for Benton County, right?
That's correct.
That includes long-range planning.
It does.
Let me ask you to put on your long-range planner hat here, because I think we all know that the Scout facility is not of indefinite duration. It has a time span, correct?
That's correct.
One of Chair Drew's questions was to ask the likely future for dryland agriculture in the Horse Heaven Hills with or without the project. So with that in mind, if you try to imagine a scenario where the project is permitted and there is this income stream that is introduced into the land use dynamic that you've described, but after the project runs its useful life at say year 30 or year 35, what would you want the council to know about your best understanding or your best prediction of what this landscape will be at that point? In other words, do you foresee that over the long term, the project will allow the reestablishment of agriculture, or do you think that in decades in the future we'll be dealing with something completely different?
From a land standpoint, I don't believe that this is going to promote agriculture into the future, and it may take 1 or 2 generations. But you know, I compare the beginning of this project and this region to something that of Hanford Nuclear Reservation. So White Bluffs community was a thriving agricultural community, and then the nuclear reactor came in, and now it's very barren and there's no agriculture happening and it's not being utilized to its full potential. And my worry as a planner is that this encroachment of this project will start that ball rolling for our unique and beautiful Horse Heaven Hills. As Mr. Wiley so eloquently spoke in his grandmother's poem about how important the landscape is and the stewardship of the land is to the people who live there, I think that will become unraveled, and we're going to see many more instances where if there's one wind farm project, there'll be another one, and it will kind of have a snowball effect and eventually become energy reservation as Hanford is today, which would be completely unfortunate because this is a unique and very prime area for our region.
Ms. Cook, one of the other points that Mr. Wiley was very compelling on is he described the actual nature of farming up there in the Horse Heaven. He described highly erodible lands. He described low rainfall, low production. Generally, I think, and incredibly explaining this is a very difficult place to farm. In your opinion, does it actually make it more vulnerable to the kind of changes that you attribute to the Scout facility? In other words, is it a more fragile kind of farming community than what you might see, say, in the Midwest or other areas of the country? If you have an opinion on that.
I would say so. I would say that because of the uniqueness of the areas Mr. Wiley spoke to, it's even more delicate and even more subject to change as other maybe more robust or resilient agricultural areas are. And so their ability to adapt and to bounce back from something that disrupts or fragments their operations would be much, much more difficult, as Mr. Wiley pointed out, than even the farms a few miles down the road that have irrigation that could maybe pivot and do something else. So I believe that areas like his are even more valuable and more important to us as the county and the state to protect, because that type of agriculture is very sensitive to outside pressures. And I wouldn't personally or professionally want to see that land lost to large corporations and, you know, industrialization and that sort of practice, because it is unique. And as Mr. Wiley mentioned, the community up there is like none other. And I feel like those are being lost, unfortunately, due to these scales of economy that are having to happen for financial and economic reasons.
I really appreciate your perspective, Ms. Cook, and your focus on Chair Drew's questions. I don't have anything else for you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Ms. Cook. Let me see if any other council members first have questions, and then I'll come back to the parties. Lenny Young.
Good morning, Ms. Cook. My name is Lenny Young. I represent the Department of Natural Resources on the council. Could you describe how Benton County and your department determines what is in the best interests, best long-term interests of agriculture in the county? And to what extent does that process incorporate the views of farmers?
The county has state statutes and mandates, which we must meet, and we evaluate, we begin that evaluation process through our comprehensive plan. Our areas of long-term agricultural significance have been designated by, I believe, 9 items that we must evaluate lands for in order to designate and zone those appropriately. We often hold public hearings, especially most recently in 2018 when we did our agricultural lands analysis, where we reached out to all the affected and non-affected parties, and we have received some input from people, but not actively, as is the case in land use planning. It is typically an open public process, but unfortunately, we do not see a lot of engagement from the community or interest, frankly.
Does the county make any special effort to outreach to farmers and learn their views as opposed to the general public, or is it all done evenly?
In context to what?
In terms of maybe zoning decisions or long-term land use planning decisions?
Not as the whole. We don't specifically identify parties one way or the other, as it's we try to maintain a non-biased approach to all those landowners affected. So we don't necessarily reach out to interest groups. However, if there is a topic that we feel like we should be getting more input from a particular type or group or demographic of people, we will try to make the best efforts that we can to reach out to those who may be interested. As I mentioned, during the agricultural lands analysis, we did send out multiple postcards, I believe, to agricultural people who may or may not be affected by the changes, which was above and beyond what our minimum state statutes require. If there's other types of projects or other land use type decisions, we may reach out to others. However, again, because we're the county, we have to maintain a non-biased or preferential treatment of certain types of people.
Okay. And I have just one more question for you. Could you estimate what proportion of the agricultural lands in the project area are owned by people who actually live there and farm the land themselves versus absentee landowners who might live elsewhere and not directly work the land themselves?
Yeah, I don't know specifically as far as whether or not they're absentee and lease the land out to others like Mr. Wiley, but I do have those figures in front of me. So out of the 40 or so leases, 66% are local. Of that number, only 9 live within the project area, according to the county's assessor's records, from what I could gather. And then 34% of the leasees do not live in the region. They are out of the region. Most of them were located on the west side of Washington.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your response. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Thanks, Ms. Cook. Any other questions for Ms. Cook? I see a hand up. Mr. Levitt.
Hello, Ms. Cook. I think we spoke last time you testified. I just wanted to clarify the numbers you just mentioned. What is the source and how would you be able to verify the accuracy of that data, that information?
So the source was, there was a list of the leasees provided on the FSEC website. From that, our staff ran the parcels, and from the parcel information, we gathered the mailing addresses and the home addresses for all of those, and we compiled and analyzed that to determine if they were local addresses within the lease boundary, if they were local addresses of people who live in one of the urban towns in the region, or if they were elsewhere in Washington State or throughout the country.
Okay, and perhaps a caveat to that data is that it doesn't necessarily indicate whether any of those families or landowners are for, neutral, or against the proposed project, other than that, the people that are leasing are clearly interested in the project.
That's correct. It was just a breakdown of the location or the apparent locations of the people who have signed leases with Scout. It wasn't a nod to who may or may not be for or against.
Okay, and then maybe one clarification question from your previous testimony and in your written testimony. It does seem like quite a bit of your testimony blends your role as a land use planner and your personal experience growing up in the Valley and growing up in a farming community. Could you tell me why, you're here representing the county as the planning manager for land use? Why did you decide to include so much personal information?
I decided to include personal information because I have a background specifically for this region, which goes beyond my professional my professional standing as a planner as well. And that, as Mr. Wiley spoke to, being raised in this region because it is a unique region and the community is very different from other communities, it uniquely poses me to provide other insights. And as a planner, it uniquely poses me to ensure that this region is understood and protected and heard when making land use decisions as well. Being fluent in your local communities is a very important job. From my position, I feel like it helps me do my job better to understand what the communities are going through, what the communities may or may not need or want, and the ability to help have those conversations or know people to have conversations with in those areas.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that you're here and I appreciate your testimony.
There's one other hand. Ms. Brewster, I think you have your hand up as well.
Yes. Hi, I'm Stacy Brewster. I'm the member from the Utilities and Transportation Commission. One question about, does the county in any way prioritize who is farming in the ag land? So is there any sort of prioritization for the smaller family farms, or is any farming okay? So if this land, if the farmers are failing and sell off to industrial farmers, is that just as good as the local community that is there now?
Yeah, the county doesn't give preference on to who owns the properties. If we have a large corporation such as the Bill Gates Foundation come in and want to work with us to further develop their agricultural properties, or we have someone like Mr. Wiley and his family come in and want to work with us on furthering developing the agriculture on their properties within the context of what we do, we treat both of them equally and don't have any biased or opinion on the merit of who may be better off or not, or make more money or that sort of thing. They're both doing uses that we can assist with.
So I'm hearing ag land is ag land. It doesn't matter who's farming. Thank you.
Yep.
All right, council members, I don't see any other hands up. I'm gonna go back to the parties. Mr. Harper, any other questions that those bring forward?
No, thank you, Your Honor.
Mr. McMahon?
Just a couple, Your Honor. Thank you. Ms. Cook, you just compared the project to the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, didn't you?
I drew similarities to the two, yes.
Okay, and are you aware, is it your view that the Hanford Nuclear Reservation caused farmers to leave farming in that vicinity?
I believe they were removed from their properties, yes.
So they were removed from their properties, how?
I don't know the background of that whether or not the land was taken or if they were bought out, but I do know that they were an active community of farmers and they are no longer there due to an energy project.
And you're comparing that energy project and the influence of that to Horsehaven Hills Wind Farm.
I'm not making that direct comparison. I'm saying that I could foresee something like that happening if this region expands as a energy site.
And the Hanford Nuclear Reservation caused farmers to leave because of eminent domain. You're aware of that, I assume.
I will take your word for it.
I have nothing further.
All right, thank you, Mr. McMahon. Mr. Harper, did that require any further? Okay, none.
No, it doesn't.
Mr. Rambrew, any questions? And if you have any, I'd hope we'd limit them to true focus questions and not some drawing out kind of what I would call friendly redirect. So limited to what we've heard today, anything?
No friendly redirect, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. Volkers, Ms. Reineveld, anything for this witness?
No questions from the acclamation, Your Honor. Thank you.
No questions from Council for the Environment. Thank you.
All right, Ms. Cook, thanks for visiting with us again. I definitely appreciate your availability and helping us flesh out what is lingering questions from last week's discussions about compatibility and the conditional use permit questions the council will wrestle with. All right, we've hit 10:15, and I think our schedule this morning has next Mr. Crouppen, and I'll be going over with Mr. Crouppen the list of exhibits, and Mr. Rambrew, I hope you will keep score with me on what the various orders striking still left in. So I've got that prepared. I've been working with Ms. Massengale this morning to make sure we're both on track. Let's come back at, say, 10:30 and start Mr. Crouppen's testimony, and that at least keeps us 15 minutes ahead of the original. All right, thank you. We'll be back at 10:30. All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to resume with Mr. Krupin's testimony. Got the list, I hope, of what are Mr. Krupin's exhibits that have not been stricken. And just for council members' orientation, there were a number of pre-filed exhibits that one party moved to have stricken. It took a little while to sort these out through the course of the litigation. But I think I've got these, and Mr. Aramburu and Mr. McMahon, if you'll follow along with me. I think, Mr. Krupin, what we have admitted or to be admitted and adopted today from the original pre-filed testimony, parts of Exhibit 5301, those are pages 1 through page 3, line 11. Exhibit 5302_T, we have pages 1, lines 1 through 21, and then it gets a little granular here. Page 33, line 18 through page 37, line 20. Page 38, lines 7 through 17. Page 40, line 13 through page 41, line 23. Page 50, lines 4 to 22. And then page 96 all the way to page 105, line 14. And those are the admitted portions or to be adopted portions of Exhibit 5302T. On some response testimony that came in, there is Exhibit 5303, and the portions of that are admitted are page 2, starting with words about the United States Census. And you'll see a series of charts and maps that Mr. Krupin created, I believe, to show the distances from various homes to projects. So page 2, starting with that US Census language, including all the maps and charts through the first one at the top of page 8. And then I believe all of Exhibit 5305 is admitted. And there's one other Exhibit 5307R that was not addressed with the motion to strike. So that had no ruling or no consideration by me. So that's also admitted. And I think I'll ask Ms. Massengale if she's keeping track with me if there's anything I might have left out, and then I'll check with Mr. McMahon and Mr. Aramburu if that's a complete list.
This is Lisa Massengale. Judge Torma, I just wanted to double check the numbers with you really quickly. I have exhibits 5301, at least in part for some of these, 5301, 530T_T, 5303_T, 5305_R, 5306_R, and 5307_R. Is that correct?
Correct. I think 5306 may have been stricken. Yes, I believe it was. And that would have been the oral ruling done yesterday. So that one, the transcript went out and should reflect that as well. Mr. McMahon, with that other clarification about 5306, any changes to what I've said or from what your notes recall?
One moment, Your Honor, please.
And council members, I apologize for this. It's a little bit of a complicated list, redlining, and we'll make sure at the ultimate, when we're ready for deliberations, you have a redlined version of that. I haven't given Mr. Aramburu and Ms. Coho a whole lot of time to respond to these orders. So once the hearing has a little bit of breathing space, or perhaps next week, we can see those updated exhibits formally in the record. But I just want you to be aware some of the material was stricken. Mr. Aramburu, while we're waiting for the folks at Stoll Reeves to confirm.
We do confirm, Your Honor. Thank you. Sorry.
All right. Mr. Aramburu, did you have any questions or think that I missed anything?
As I've said before, we're very much scrambling here with the public hearing tonight, multiple questions about it and other testimony. We have done the best we can to provide strikeout versions to.
And you will. I'm not rushing you on that. I just with the list that I just recited, did you have any corrections before I have Mr. Crouppen adopt that list of documents?
Um, we understand what you're stricken. Obviously, we don't agree with your ruling, but I think we have provided all of the stricken, admitted and stricken materials to Mr. Crouppen, and I think he'll be ready to testify about what's left.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Crouppen, with all apologies for the striking in the evidentiary rulings, let me swear you in to adopt, as Mr. Arambu says, what's left. Do you, Paul Crouppen, solemnly swear or affirm that all testimony that's going to be adopted today, subject to the orders that have been issued, is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and that your responses to questions today will be the same?
I do.
All right, thank you. Nice to meet you. Let me have Mr. Arambu give if he wants, a short 30,000-foot synopsis of what you're presenting, and then turn you over for cross-exam.
What were the changes that have been made? I don't have a particular vision of that. Mr. Crouppen has been particularly focused in the remaining testimony on the numbers of persons impacted in comparison to other wind turbine projects. So his testimony is clear on those points. So he's available for cross-examination.
Thank you, sir. We have two different parties, council members, who've asked to pose questions to Mr. Crouppen. They're both the applicant and Ms. Reineveld as counsel for the environment. I don't know, counsel, if you've worked out an order of examination today.
Your Honor, Tim McMahon here on behalf of Scott Clean Energy. We have no questions for this witness.
All right, then we'll see if Mr. Crouppen has any questions to be posed from Ms. Reineveld, and if not, we'll go to council members as well.
Good afternoon, Your Honor, Mr. Crouppen. I do have some questions for you just pertaining to the portions of your testimony on fugitive dust. I understand that those are still admitted.
Correct.
So my name, Mr. Crouppen, is Sarah Reineveld. As you may know, I am an Assistant Attorney General in the Environmental Protection Division, and I am assigned as counsel for the environment to this matter. Counsel for the Environment represents the public and its interest in protecting the environment. You are a retired resident of Kennewick, is that correct?
Yes, I retired in 2003. I since built a PR firm, a publishing company. I got a patent on a search engine technology, and I still work a little bit at home. I donate my time for the past year to this Tri-Cities Cares project.
Okay, and you are testifying on behalf of the Tri-Cities Care project, is that correct? You're a witness of Tri-Cities Care?
Yes, I volunteered for them for many months, and then they offered me a position on the board, so I am one of the board members of Tri-City Cares.
And can you tell us just a little bit more about your involvement on the board and your work with Tri-Cities Care?
Sure. When I first learned about the project last summer, I missed the early release of the application. I just was not paying attention. But when I learned about it last summer, the more I learned, the more concerned I became. As an environmental protection specialist and a retired attorney, I saw a lot of issues with environmental impacts and economics. And I started doing tours with various city council members, county officials. We created maps, and I helped Tri-City Cares create an educational outreach program. Did a lot of work with digital mapping programs to try and make it easy for people to understand what this project is all about.
Thank you. And according to the testimony that has been admitted, you have a BA in environmental biology and an MS in physical geography, hydrology, and water quality. Is that correct?
Correct.
And is it fair to say that your master's degree was primarily focused on physical geography and the study of water?
Yes. There's probably a single word called fluvial geomorphology, and so I specialized in the effect of water on the landscape.
And you worked for the Oregon Department of for environmental water quality, that division, among other agencies. Is that correct?
That was just one summer of my career. I was in the non-point source water quality division at that time.
Okay.
I then actually spent most of my career BLM, Forest Service. Did a little bit of work publishing a water supply paper with the USGS, and then I came to the Department of Energy, and I spent 20 years in the federal building in Richmond.
Okay. And you stated, according to your testimony, that you've worked as a project leader and program manager of regulatory compliance programs covering air. Is that correct?
Air, water, toxic chemicals, hazardous chemicals. I don't think there was an environmental program at the Hanford site that I didn't have project or program management leadership of during my stint there.
Okay, so this experience was primarily related to the Hanford site, is that correct?
Well, I had 7 years in Idaho doing mining, forestry, roads, bridges, dams, and then I came to DOE, and DOE was chemical and nuclear facilities, power plants, chemical processing plants, some of the most complex industrial facilities, that people create. I got to work on.
Do you consider yourself an expert in air quality standards or programs in Washington State?
I'm familiar with them. I wouldn't call myself an expert in them. I managed those programs. The experts reported to me, and I helped them publish their documents and their annual reports. I oversaw their the work that they did when they were working on creating operational programs. I was the compliance specialist for DOE. I had counterparts. I got to work with them daily, and air, water. As I said, I was multidisciplinary.
Thank you. So in your direct testimony, starting on exhibit 5307, I believe it's page 97, you offer some testimony on the project's impacts on fugitive dust emissions. Is that correct?
Yes.
And in the application, the applicant identifies that there will be likely an increase in the amount of fugitive dust created during construction of the project, correct?
Yes.
And you provide testimony in that exhibit 5302 about the regulatory requirements pertaining to fugitive dust. Is that correct?
I did.
And you would agree that sections of the Washington Administrative Code establish requirements for review and issuance of construction approvals for new sources of air emissions under FSEC's jurisdiction, correct?
I believe that should be correct.
And there are permits that are required for some new sources of regulated industrial activity emitting air pollutants. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what is your understanding of the permits, if any, that the applicant would be required to obtain for the construction of this project that could, as you stated, result in an increase in fugitive dust?
Oh boy. I don't recall from the ASC, but I believe the ASC has the listing of permits, and it has a full section in there in which they repeat the requirements specifically and make compliance declarations. And I don't really recall exactly which permit regulations are pertinent without reviewing them.
Okay, so you don't recall whether or not the applicant would be required to obtain permits in this case pertaining to regulating air emissions. Is that correct?
No, I don't think they're releasing any chemical emissions, and I don't think there's a permit for, this is off the top of my head trying to remember, I don't think there's a permit requirement for fugitive dust either. I think there are an AAQS background air emissions that can't be exceeded, but this is really stretching my memory as regards the actual requirements here. But I do believe the concern I have goes to the amount of dust, fugitive dust created. I expressed a concern about the lack of monitoring of PM10 and PM2.5. And I think I drove attention to the fact that the dust control would be serious issue down in the valley, because the 100 miles of road is going to produce a lot lot of dust that can be blowing into the valley.
Thank you, Mr. Crouppen. I would just encourage you just listen to my question. It was just around permits, and if we can move to kind of strike the latter part of that testimony as non-responsive. So you would agree that
I'll sustain the objection and strike that, Ms. Reinabel, but when we get to the transcript, we'll make sure that portion that's non-responsive is stricken.
Thank you, Your Honor. You would agree that the owner or operator of a source that creates fugitive dust must take reasonable precautions to prevent that fugitive dust from becoming airborne. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the applicant, I believe you stated this in your testimony, is required to maintain and produce a dust control plan and identify management best practices and operational procedures to effectively control that dust. Is that correct?
Yes.
And is it your understanding, based on your review of the application, that the applicant has agreed in the application to prepare a dust control plan?
Yes.
And according to the application, that plan would consider an incorporated dust control guidance from the Benton Clean Air Energy as applicable, correct?
Yes.
And what is your understanding of when the applicant's required to produce that plan?
Oh, I'm not exactly sure. I'm not exactly sure when they have to produce the plan.
Okay. Do you have any reason to believe that the applicant would not timely create and provide a dust control plan to meet the requirements of, I believe it's the Benton County Clean Air Agency?
No, I have no reason to suspect that they wouldn't submit one. My question goes to the adequacy of that plan, whether it would meet the BCAA requirements.
Okay. And in your testimony, I believe it's on page 100, you conclude in relation just to the fugitive dust emissions that the applicant is simply ignoring the regulatory requirements, quote and unquote. Is that correct?
Without a plan in hand, to me, that's an empty notebook. So yes, I believe that at this point in time, they are stating their commitment to submit a plan. I have no way of addressing the meaningfulness of the plan itself.
Do the regulatory requirements require the applicant to have produced a plan as part of the application?
I'm not exactly sure if the regulations required the plan for the ASC or whether it can be done after the ASC has been approved.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Crouppen. I don't have any further questions for you.
Chair Drew, council members, I'm going to see if you have any questions for Mr. Crouppen on those portions of the testimony that have been adopted and now admitted this morning, or the questioning from Council for the Environment. I don't see any from Chair Drew. And from the council members I can see, I'm seeing some heads the other way, but Mr. Levitt, Department of Ecology.
Hi, Mr. Crouppen. My name is Eli Levitt. I work at the Department of Ecology. I'm Ecology's FSAC member, council member. Could you just tell us a little bit more about the data analysis that you did using U.S. Census data? So it looks like you gathered a rough estimate of the population within a certain mileage of different wind farms in different areas of the country. Can you summarize it briefly, please?
Actually, we had a volunteer who owns a company that does mass data analysis, and he created a website with a power data tool for us. Voluntary gave us access to it. It overlaid the National Wind Power Database and the U.S. Census data, and we identified groups of turbines, and then had them. He create this program will automatically create these maps.
Okay, thank you. And then it sounds like you've been involved in Tri-City Cares for a while. Can you tell me, it seems like the group formed fairly recently, and clearly, the mission and the website is pretty clear, but does say at one point, we are a local grassroots movement focused on protecting the environment and people. I'm curious if the organization has done anything like restoration projects in the Horse Heaven Hills area since being founded, or other environmental projects.
The group was an evolution of two other groups that came before it. And I believe the 501c3 application was filed in June of 2022. And then they ran without my presence until July of 2000. Oh, no, I think I may be off a year, 2021. And then I didn't get involved until they had been on the ground for a year. And to my knowledge, since I've been involved in just working on this project. I believe they have not done any other conservation projects on the ground that I'm aware of. I'd have to ask.
Okay, thank you. That's it.
Okay.
Thank you, council members. Any other questions? I'm looking for those electronic hands, and if they don't go up, I think Mr. Rambrew, we need to come back to you and any other attorneys that might have questions for Mr. Crouppen in follow-up. Mr. Rambrew, I'll defer to you.
Nothing further from me. Thank you.
All right. Any other council for parties have questions?
Your Honor, if I may, I do have a follow-up question to Ms. Reineveld.
Certainly. Go ahead, Ms. Volkers.
Good morning, Mr. Crouppen, Shona Volkers for Yakima Nation. You were asked a series of questions about the creation of a dust control plan for the project. My question is, in your opinion, how much can that plan really be developed when the project doesn't yet have a determined water source?
Ms. Volkers, I'm not sure if Mr. Crouppen heard your question. Maybe you can restate it.
Oh, was that to me? I thought you were asking a question of Ms. Reineveld.
Oh, no, she's just following up on that line of inquiry. Sorry.
I'm also just going to object that this is somewhat outside of the scope of my cross-examination and assumes facts that are not in evidence. Perhaps Ms. Volkers could rephrase.
Well, I think Ms. Volkers asked exactly what she wanted to ask, that the water supply and how it relates to the dust control. So there's at least a relevant thread connecting these questions. Ms. Volkers, am I misstating the motivation?
No, I think you've got it right, Your Honor. There's not a confirmed water source for the project, and so I'm just trying to understand Mr. Crouppen's opinion about how that would inform the ability to create a dust control plan when she was asked about the timing and submission of such a plan.
Perfect. Okay. Mr. Crouppen, go ahead.
Okay, forgive me for not understanding that this question is being directed at me. I personally believe that, unless you really know where water is coming from and how much you have available, creating a dust control plan without that type of information doesn't yield anything meaningful. I think the application, the ASC states they are going to require 220,000 gallons of water per day during construction for dust control, primarily on roads and during turbine foundation construction and that sort of thing. And unless there's an adequate source of water, it's pretty hard to determine how effective dust control on roads will be. Does that answer your question?
I think it does. Thank you.
All right, Ms. Reineveld, in fairness, did you want to follow up on that?
No, I don't have anything further. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. And Mr. Crouppen, nice to meet you. I appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you.
Council members, before we turn to the next witness, Dave Sharp, I wanted to ask and let you know about Lonnie Click again. He's the fire chief out there in Benton County, and he's busy in Spokane fighting fires. I asked you yesterday and let you know he probably has more more things on his plate than he might want, and whether or not you have questions. If we know today that you've reviewed the testimony and you have no questions, then the stipulation is his exhibits would be adopted, and we'd go on without disrupting his attention the rest of the week. If you think you're going to have questions or you want more time, please put up an electronic hand. All right, I'm not seeing any hands go up. So council members, again, going once, going twice, correct me if I'm wrong. We're just going to let Mr. Aramburu know to reach out to Mr. Click, release him from the obligation to testify, and we'll simply adopt his testimony. Chair Drew, comment on that or a question?
I sent you a question yesterday.
I have forgotten already. So we'll, is it the question that we might be able to pose to him if necessary to supply a written response if we can't get him this week?
That's fine.
Okay, I will dig that up and provide it to Mr. Aramburu and go from there. Thank you, Chair Drew, for reminding me.
Thank you.
All right, so Mr. Aramburu, at least we have a potential solution for getting Chair Drew's question answered. If Mr. Click's not available, we'll get that done in writing.
Could I just ask the chair, is it a question to simply state so we don't have to run it through the everybody's emails? If it isn't, then that's fine.
My questions are usually pretty simple, yes.
Okay.
I'll find the email and I'll get it on the record here shortly. So at this point, we have Dave Sharp coming on to testify. And Mr. Sharp, good morning. I know I've seen you on the screen a little bit today. I'll get you back in front of me here. I think I'm swearing you in to adopt some limited testimony as follows. Exhibit 5402_T, page 1, lines 1 to 15. And there's the latter parts of the testimony go to page 36, line 11, where I think at that point you start talking about some ice throw hazards that you're familiar with, all the way to page 44, line 22. In the response and reply testimony, there were a couple of things about other communities on exhibit 5404, page 2. You have a series of questions and answers that you lay out there, a question and comment. So number 3, number 4, and number 5 on page 2 of exhibit 5404 are admitted, and 2 other recreational maps showing some of the impacts and the location of the turbine strings next to popular recreation trails in the Benton County area. Maps are contained at exhibit 5410 and 5411. Mr. McMahon, Mr. Aramburu, those are the exhibits that I have per the rulings issued earlier this month. Any corrections to those?
You have endeavored to provide to Mr. Sharp I don't want to call them redacted, the stricken testimony and the testimony that was kept in. So I trust he has that in front of him.
Yeah, it looked like he was checking off as I was going along, so I appreciate that as well. Mr. McMahon, any corrections or additions?
No, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. Mr. Sharp, you're on mute.
I may have missed the very first one that you mentioned. I was scrolling.
Sure. Your original pre-filed testimony was 5402. And I think
Yes.
page one, lines 1 to 15, I think is your introduction to who you are. And then at page 36, starting line 11 through page 44, line 22.
Page 44.
So 36 to 44 in general.
'36, line 11. Okay.
Great. All right, sir. If you'll raise your right hand. Do you, Dave Sharp, solemnly swear or affirm that all the testimony contained in those exhibits we've detailed, as well as any questions you provide answers to today, will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
All right. Mr. Aramburu, did you want to introduce this witness, or shall we just make him available for cross-exam?
Judge Strom, I think you've kind of outlined the subject matter that is left in the testimony, so I don't think it needs further elucidation. So Mr. Sharp would be available for questions.
Excellent. Mr. McMahon and Ms. Reineveld are the two attorneys that had questions. Mr. McMahon, do you have any for this witness?
We do not, Your Honor. Thank you.
And Ms. Reineveld?
Counsel for the Environment does not have any questions for this witness on his admitted testimony. Thank you.
All right, Chair Drew and council members. Okay, I'm not seeing any, Mr. Sharp, and I didn't write down any questions of my own. I certainly, as an outdoor enthusiast myself, I appreciate the maps that you provided. And I've walked some of those trails when I visited Benton County. So thank you for providing those and indicating where these wind turbines will be along those routes. All right, so those exhibits that have not been stricken are admitted from Mr. Sharp. Thank you, sir. Council, our next order of business is to continue the Troy Ramig testimony from yesterday. When we left off, I think Ms. Volkers was beginning to do her cross-exam. So let me see if we have Mr. Ramig available to resume his testimony today. I see you on my screen, Mr. Ramig. Thank you. And Ms. Volkers, are you ready to resume and maybe remind us where you left off yesterday to orient council members again?
Thank you, Honor. I am ready to resume. I had one other issue that I wanted to address, but I think we can do that before the lunch break. So I'm ready to go with Mr. Ramig's testimony, and I believe we wrapped up with the Moon memo sufficiently yesterday, so I'm not going to ask that we go back to it right now.
Okay, and where you're beginning today, will it be an open session questions, or do we need to go into a closed record session?
Open session, Your Honor.
All right, you can proceed. Thank you.
Okay. And good morning, Mr. Ramig. Happy
morning.
To be on camera for you today. So I want to kind of go back and talk a little more on your involvement on the project in the same way that I asked Mr. Jansen, given that you're both sponsoring a significant portion of this application that's relevant to Yaak Nation's interests. I believe I saw in your direct testimony that you began working for Tetra Tech in November of 2021. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And is that then fair to say that when you first began working for Scout Clean Energy, or was there a lapse? When did you first start working for Scout?
At the same time. Yep, you're right. Correct.
Okay. So you didn't work on any sections of the application, the original application for site certification that was submitted?
That's correct. Not the original. Correct. Yes.
Okay. Do you know who actually created or wrote the original amended sites application, specifically section 3.4?
I do, yeah. And I think Mr. Jansen alluded to this as well. It's certainly always a team effort. There are a lot of technical disciplines that are involved in drafting even the biological resources section. The individuals that were involved, I mean, I can name them off. Karen Brimacombe, botany, Jess Taylor, wetlands, John Crookston, wildlife biology. Mr. Jansen contributed, as he alluded to yesterday. Matt Cambier, biology, and there are probably others I'm forgetting at this point in time. Many of those, as I came on board in November of 2021, those individuals were still involved and are still involved in the project today. So I'm sort of the lucky one that gets to be the figurehead for the team. Yeah.
And so by team, those are all folks at Tetra Tech, is that correct?
That's correct. Yep, with the exception of Mr. Jansen, who's at West. Correct. Yes.
Right. Sorry. Mr. Kobus also contributed to writing section 3.4. Correct.
I would say certainly was involved in the review process, and actually, I guess to expand on my previous answer a little bit, even beyond the biological resource experts, at Tetra Tech we also have technical editors, we have project management teams that do a lot of kind of quality control on the work that is produced, and in that same way, I mean, it is a work product produced by Scout Clean Energy. So in that way, they are involved in the sort of review and editing of the document.
Okay, and I know you were with us all of yesterday, so I am hoping we can make time and stick to yeses and nos when possible. So was that a yes on Mr. Kobus contributing to section 3.4 of the application?
Yes.
Okay. So understanding that you didn't draft the original application, did you participate at all in the edits on the amended application for site certification?
Yes, I did.
Can you generally talk us through which portions of that you wrote, which those red lines?
Absolutely. Certainly 3.4. So the edits that you see on section 3.4. I was heavily involved in the revisions to the habitat mitigation plan, Appendix L, I think it is. Sorry. And then generally involved, there were a few updates to some of the biological resources reports because new information had been collected since the original was submitted. In those cases, I was involved in reviewing and providing oversight in those documents.
Okay, thank you. You got ahead of me on some of my questions. My question I asked though was about within section 3.4, what did you contribute to in terms of updates to the amended site certification?
Apologies, I thought you said application, which includes the appendices. Section 3.4, that's essentially background and assessment of potential impacts on the projects on wildlife resources. The additions, the notable additions in the revision have a lot to do with just sort of updating information that was relevant to additional field data that was collected, and then there was a pretty good addition on pronghorn in particular. So those are my contributions.
And I know we'll talk about this. I expect we'll talk about this more later. But you referenced pronghorn, and so just so we're all aware, though, the habitat mitigation plan doesn't actually recommend any mitigation for the project's impacts to the pronghorn. Correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Before we go further today, Mr. Armick, I think it would be helpful if you could share with everyone how you define the term best available science.
Yeah, happy to. I think, I mean, there are some, as we noted yesterday, there are some specific definitions in the Washington Administrative Code, which we can talk about later. But my, my definition is simply a combination of published literature, so peer-reviewed published literature, combined with, I would say, local and state resource agency information on species, and I'll just say, species and habitats, wildlife species and habitats, to kind of stay within the guidelines of that. And then project-specific data that's collected, which we went over in detail yesterday. So I think it's a combination of things. I also think that we routinely see personal communications, which is sometimes information that's not, maybe hasn't been published yet, but it's information from a resource expert or somebody who has information on the ground that's relevant to the assessment.
And I know you and Mr. Jensen are referencing regulations. Those aren't FSEC zone regulations, correct?
They're not FSECs. They are Washington Administrative Code and sort of Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife's, I think, attempt at for entities that are doing, especially cities, counties, and state agencies that are going through critical areas, ordinances, and the SEPA process. It's sort of guidance on how to navigate this sort of gray area of best available science.
Yeah, so it's the critical areas regulations, right?
Correct.
And so as a professional, do you, I'm hearing a definition from you that to me resonates with what I've heard from the other biologists in the case. So is it fair to say that as a professional, you're not limited by a legal definition of best available science? You're going off of your experience and education to evaluate sources that come to you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Is it safe to say that part of your role is to advise Scout Clean Energy on how to design their project in order to be consistent with best available science?
I would say part of my role is to, we collect information and it's all documented in the application and in other places. And to essentially inform Scout Clean Energy of how their project, how the project as designed is going to impact those resources. And then the ramifications of those impacts related to, avoidance, minimization, and mitigation. I think certainly sometimes that does result in some design changes or design discussions, but not always. So I would say we're on the information providing side of the table, but we're not, personally, I'm not involved in the design discussions of the project.
You used the phrase avoid, minimize, and mitigate, and that's also come up a few times, maybe not as much this week as in the deposition. So is it fair to say that that general approach of avoidance, if not avoidance, then minimization, and if not minimization, then mitigation, is consistent with so legal or scientific goals for protecting wildlife and habitat?
Yes, absolutely. Both at the state and federal level, that's the sort of continuum.
Okay. Mr. Jansen spoke yesterday about the applicant making project design decisions based on, I believe he said, commercial concerns. Has there been times that the applicant has made project design decisions based on commercial design concerns that were contrary to your advice regarding impacts to wildlife and habitat?
I guess I'm not clear on what commercial means in that context. And so I'll just note that as I answer this question, I'm not exactly sure what commercial means. I think that the answer to the rest of your question is that I can't think of a time when they have made design changes that were contrary to information that we had provided. I'll leave it there.
Yesterday, Mr. Jansen also said that he believes the project design, taking into account the Moon Memo, is consistent with best available science. Is that your opinion as well, Mr. Romig?
Yeah, I would say yes.
Okay. And the term novel, NOVEL, has been used a few times to reference certain scientific data reports. Can you explain in your words what you understand the term novel to mean?
May I ask you to provide the example of when it was used? I'm sorry.
Well, it was used in, and I don't remember the exact answer yesterday, but I'll give you an example.
Thank you.
The memo that you authored, that is Exhibit 5 to Mr. Watson's deposition, I believe Exhibit 5, but it's a memo about the use of, I believe the word was novel, ferruginous hawk data. Do you recall writing a memo about the use of novel ferruginous hawk data?
Yeah, I think. I'm sorry.
I was just trying to finish that. I think that we could pull it up, but I think for time's sake, if you remember the memo, I was just trying to use an example of when I've seen it come from your letterhead, sir.
Thank you very much. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think in that case, I mean, novel, I guess it's sort of a little bit of a term of art for, kind of new or unique information. Also, we sometimes use that word when we talk about, novel approaches to, again, avoidance, minimization, and mitigation. So kind of new, maybe out of the box solutions to things like that. So it could have a couple different meanings.
And you worked with Mr. Jansen on a population viability analysis regarding the ferruginous hawks, correct?
I did not. I reviewed the document, but I did not work on that document.
Okay. You reviewed that document. Would you consider that document to be novel scientific information?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Okay. Again, I'm just trying to understand how these terms are working together. So is there a distinction between novel scientific information and emerging scientific information in your mind?
I would say that's a difficult question. I would say probably not, other than the fact that in my mind, emerging, while it is new, it is also sometimes unsettled science. Does that make sense? So in other words, we would get new information that is, maybe hasn't settled within the community in the same way that novel information might have in terms of its utility on a project. So there might be a slight difference here, but very small.
If it's possible, put it on kind of a gradient scale. Would it go from emerging to novel to peer reviewed? I mean, I'm still trying to understand the distinctions here in understanding that there's certainly value that I've heard in gray literature, and so I'm not trying to diminish the value of any of this, but I'm trying to weigh these sources against each other. Is there a gradient there that you're describing?
I wouldn't say it's a gradient. I think novel or emerging are, somewhat synonymous, as I noted. I think either of those can be peer reviewed, or either of those could be gray literature. I think the continuum that you're describing really it's less about, in my view, less about novel or emerging. It's more about sort of like anecdotal, um, agency guidance, gray literature, peer reviewed literature. So that might be the continuum that I would think about.
In that order?
Yeah.
And why would peer review be on this other side from guidance? Is it have to do with the timing because guidance takes a while to update? Why would peer review be after formal guidance?
Yeah, I think that I think that when I think about that, I would say that published literature, and Mr. Jansen talked about this yesterday, but published literature in peer-reviewed journals, it's a little bit standalone in the fact that it is in fact peer-reviewed. Everything else is not necessarily peer-reviewed, or it's peer-reviewed at if it's like WWW guidance, it's certainly reviewed within the department, peer reviewed within the department, but maybe not widely peer reviewed within the scientific community. So I think that's why I would put peer reviewed literature kind of on that one end of the continuum. The other thing I would add is I think guidance, while it's based on science, it's not always the same thing as science, right? So it's certainly informed by science, but it's guidance. Whereas if you had a published research paper, that's not guidance. That's information on probably one project and observations from that one project that can then be applied to another project in certain instances if there is direct applicability. So it's a little bit nuanced.
Yeah, I think it's quite nuanced for me.
It is.
Is it your understanding that WDFW's formal guidelines are not reviewed outside of WFW before they're published?
I actually don't know.
Okay. We can move on from this technical discussion. If we could pull up Ms. Massengale, I don't know if you're the one today, or if you want me to try to share my screen. If possible, if we could pull up the mitigation plan that has been admitted into evidence by Ms. Reineveld, I would appreciate that.
Do you have an exhibit number, Ms. Folkers?
Thank you, Your Honor. I'm trying to get that now. I believe it's 3017.
Paying for it now.
All right, Ms. Owens is looking for that now. I think we had it yesterday.
We need 3017.
It's 3017. Thanks. All right, coming up here shortly.
Thank you. If we could turn to page 6 and maybe zoom in a little bit, the words are small. On the second column there, discussion a November 16th, 2021 meeting.
I have a copy here too, Ms. Volker, so I can, mine is bigger.
Okay.
Ms. Volkers, where did you want us to display?
Page 6, please.
That's page 1 in the document. Oh,
Oh, that's a little far. Oh, no, that's perfect. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. I can see it on my screen. Can you see it, Mr. Jensen?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So were you at this meeting on November 16th, 2021?
Yes.
Okay. And on that last bullet point, it says that WFW noted that the pronghorn are not regulated by the agency and recommended the FSEC consult with the Aqua Nation regarding that species.
Correct.
And I understand that that was a recommendation to FSEC, but you were there, right? And so this was also communicated with the applicant that WFW is not the regulating agency for the pronghorn.
Correct.
And it's true, though, that Scout did not reach out to Aqua Nation to request additional information on the pronghorn.
That's correct. It was left to FSEC.
Okay. But you did respond with your own memo, or I believe it was a memo or a report. You did respond shortly thereafter with your own perspective on the project's impacts of pronghorn.
That is correct. May I elaborate a little?
Please.
Yeah. We, so this came up during this meeting, and then I believe the way course of actions occurred there, FSEC did sort of coordinate with WFW to get further information about pronghorn and the relationship there. At the same time, FSEC, through a data request, requested information from the applicant about pronghorn as it relates to the project. So in response to that data request, we prepared the memo that is now in Appendix K as part of the application. And around about that same time, we were also, I think WFW via FSEC shared the summary reports from the winter survey data that we were talking about yesterday. And so in that, in our attempt in the memo to characterize the project and effects and so forth, we incorporated those summary reports, which were provided at that time, as well as kind of a broader discussion about what we know about pronghorn and renewable energy projects, mostly from places like Wyoming.
So am I understanding correctly that FSEC did ask the applicant to provide a report on the project's impacts of pronghorn, and the applicant did not reach out to the Aqua Nation at that time to request additional information to incorporate into that report or memo? Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And if we could turn now to PDF page 38, there's a map that we all looked at together yesterday. And rather than pulling up your rebuttal testimony, I do want to reorient us to something you said. So I'm going to read it here. You were asked a question about the lack of mention of the pronghorn in the habitat mitigation plan. And on page 10, your answer, I don't know if you have it there or not, but you answered on line 6. Do you have that, or should we bring it up on the screen?
I can pull it up. On page 10, which line? I'm sorry.
6.
And
this
Mr.
is,
Mr. Romig,
sorry.
I just want to make sure we're not straying into confidential information with these maps.
Not with the maps. I think this version of this exhibit is actually the redacted version, so I think we're okay there.
All right, as long as we keep your testimony and the redacted information out, we're good.
Ms. Volkers, I have it here. I think on that, the sentence that starts to make determinations about how a project might impact species movement or habitat connectivity. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes. So
okay.
Where you said to make determinations about how a project might impact species movement or habitat connectivity that might change how species use the landscape, we have to rely upon existing data. And then you said that it is standard practice to use statewide wildlife movement modeling data generated by the Washington Wildlife Habitat Connectivity Working Group and the Arid Lands Initiative. In the map that we have in front of us, this is from the Arid Lands Initiative, correct?
Correct, yep.
Okay. So understanding that it is standard practice to rely upon this, and that, of course, you can't work with data that you're not holding, once you were informed that the Yakama Nation had additional information, why didn't Scout incorporate that information into its work and its in response to FSEC's request for that memo in December of 2021?
I'm sorry, Ms. Volkers, can you repeat that again?
I'll try my best. It was long-winded. So actually no, I think I'll strike it and try to get a little more focus here. I'm trying to understand, your testimony here talks about standard practice and how you go about doing your work as a scientist. And I see that the standard practice is to use the sort of data that I believe is in front of us on the map.
Correct.
But if another entity, certainly a governmental entity regulating a wildlife species, has existing data, why wouldn't you also ask for that and include it in this type of a modeling and mapping exercise? Why wasn't Yakama Nation asked when they held that data?
Yeah, to be honest with you, I think the applicant and myself, we were relying on the FSEC's communication with Yakama Nation, kind of in a government-to-government capacity, and WFW's involvement in the work that Yakama Nation had been doing with pronghorn. We were provided the summary reports from the winter surveys, and I think at the time, and you're correct, I did not reach out. My team did not reach out directly to Yakama Nation. At the time, we assumed that was the extent of the information. So that and we incorporated it at that level.
And I don't want to hold up yet and force us into a closed session. I think I'll ask you to look at it in a little bit, but you've seen the map in the redacted or confidential version of Mr. Ganueles's PowerPoint presentation that shows individual pronghorn GPS data in the project vicinity, correct? You've seen that map?
Yeah, correct, yes.
Okay, so understanding that we're looking at this map, nothing that's in that PowerPoint map that shows that individual data that was collected is reflected in the map that we have in front of us, correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
Sorry.
He's answered the question. Go ahead.
Sorry.
Okay, we can move on. And I think we can take this off. So while you still have your rebuttal testimony in front of you, Mr. Jansen, if we could turn back to Mr. Romig.
That's okay.
Very apology for that. Mr. Romig, if we could turn back to page 8, lines 5 through 8.
Okay.
So you stated that renewable energy is a relatively new addition to this already highly altered landscape. So to suggest that this project will suddenly make the area inhospitable for pronghorn is not substantiated, nor would additional mitigation be warranted for a species recently introduced to landscape and with uncertainty of success. Is that still your position?
It is, yes.
Okay. Did you provide any rebuttal testimony, though, that was conclusive that the project would not have impacts on the pronghorn?
I did not.
Okay. In your professional opinion, how much certainty of success for any species warrants consideration of that species' habitat needs?
Could I clarify? Do you mean sort of like reintroduction success or just success generally?
Any success of a species, right? The species are at different levels of viability, should we say, right now?
Sure.
So how much does this certainty of success of any one species warrant consideration of that specific species' habitat needs?
It really shouldn't have a bearing on it.
So it wouldn't be fair to say that wildlife biologists would be more concerned about the habitat needs of a particular species as it moves towards less viability?
I think the opposite would be true, actually. We talked about this with Frugian's hawk, where as species populations decline, we have greater interest in, in those species, including, formal state and federal listings of them. So.
And maybe I'll try to get this a different way, but understanding that there are those different listings, such as candidate species, sensitive species, threatened endangers, is it your opinion that where that species at in terms of its viability into the future should or should not inform how seriously the species' habitat needs are evaluated and protected?
I mean, I think that as a matter of practice, the collective, the community, all agencies and consultants and everybody who's involved in assessing impacts from infrastructure projects on species, we tend to focus on species that are imperiled. So listed species, priority species in Washington. We are less concerned about common species. And I think that's just, it's just a matter of thinking about sort of the probability of any given impact. The probability that any given impact would cause a species to further decline or to potentially go extinct. So there's a greater chance of a rare species going extinct from collective impacts than a very common species, for example.
And you brought the word common. Are you referring to the pronghorn as common? Do you consider them to be a common species?
No, I consider them to be a reintroduced population.
Okay. In your opinion, how many years must a particular species use a habitat or landscape before we should look at how new development might affect that species?
I'm not sure there's a specific answer to that. I would say it would be relative to the species' natural history, right? So some species that might be many years, if they're a species that only reproduces every other year, for example, or whatever, for a deer mouse, it might be a much shorter time because they reproduce several times in 1 year. So I think it's probably more related to the natural history of the species.
And does that answer change at all when we're talking about priority species?
I would say no, except that I think priority species as a group are sort of treated the same, regardless of what I just described. So if it's a priority species or a listed species, it garners the attention regardless of its life history.
And should the same attention be garnered when we're talking about treaty protected wildlife species?
I'm going to object on foundation grounds. You can answer.
Yeah, that's, I think that in there's a lot of overlap between treaty protected species and the categories we just talked about, listed and otherwise. I think the policy and regulatory framework that we operate within, and again, I'm not just talking about me at Tetra Tech, but really all of us collectively as a group. For the treaty protected species that fall within that framework, those listing, listing categories, et cetera, I would say absolutely. For treaty protected species that don't fall into those categories, I think it is, they certainly are important and should be considered in processes. The way in which that happens is just a little bit less, it's not well defined, as I think we all know. So yeah, I guess maybe I'll just leave it at that.
I do, Your Honor, have a few questions that involve the PowerPoint, the confidential version of the PowerPoint submitted by Mr. Gonuelas.
All right, are we ready to display that on your end and then move into closed session and display it at that time?
I can certainly try to share it on my end, Your Honor.
Okay, because I don't think anybody else has that. It was a documentary exhibit that I don't think Ms. Massengale had. Maybe I'm wrong about that.
Your Honor, I hope we all do have this, but it was brought up during Mr. Gonuelas's testimony last week. So I believe we've seen this.
I'm sorry, I was thinking of the one from Ms. Lally.
Oh.
Different. Okay, different PowerPoint presentation. I guess I've had that one on my mind with the different shadings. So let's go ahead, council, and move into closed session. We're going to do that in a moment once I explain again to the members of the public watching today. There are some sensitive wildlife issues that are being discussed that can't be disclosed to the public. So we're going to move into a closed record session. We'll come back out as soon as possible thereafter. It's now 11:37. And Ms. Volkers, do you have a time estimate for the questions?
Yeah, yes, Your Honor, I think probably 15-20 minutes would be sufficient.
Okay, so we'll be back, we hope, prior to the noon hour and continue from there. All right, if staff can move us into the closed session. Bear with us as the technology does its thing. All right, it looks like the technology magic has brought us back into the public session. So members of the public, we're back at 11:56 in the morning, and we're going to continue on with some questions from Ms. Volkers for Troy Romig.
Thank you, Your Honor. I want to talk a little more about something that came up yesterday as well, the technical advisory committee for this project. Specific to the pronghorn, in your opinion, is it appropriate for the technical advisory committee to do anything other than post-construction monitoring for the pronghorn impacts of the project?
I would say, I mean, I would never want to, I guess, fully presuppose what they might do. I think it's certainly within their, within the power of a technical advisory committee to think about any and all wildlife species. So that could, pronghorn could certainly be something to advise on. I don't think, you mentioned post-construction monitoring for pronghorn. I guess one of the things they could do, and maybe this is where you're going, apologies, Ms. Smokers. One of the things they could do would be to recommend, additional monitoring for pronghorn, I suppose. That's, I think, not something that has been certainly within the conversation so far, but I mean, that technical advisory committee would chart their own course once they're seated.
And I think you were asked by Ms. Reineveld at the end of the day, and I apologize, I don't have the transcript in front of me and going off of memory here, but whether or not it would be appropriate for FSEC to do a further analysis on the project's impacts on pronghorn before moving forward. Would you agree or disagree with that statement?
I think essentially that's what Ms. Reineveld said, and not that it's neither of us probably should speak for her, but I think essentially she was asking, should this data that we've, this other additional data from Yakima Nation be incorporated? And I think my answer would sort of be the same. I think, more information is always a good thing. In this case, I think there would be a ways to go with the data that I've seen, a ways to go to get that data, analyzed and summarized. And I'm not talking about FSEC doing that. I'm really talking about Yakima Nation biologists doing that. I think that would be most appropriate. Analyzed, summarized in a way that could be, then brought into what is essentially a public document. And I don't, from my opinion on it, and I'd stated this in my testimony, I don't think we would come to any different conclusion on pronghorn than we did with the summary winter survey reports that we had available at the time of the application. So I don't think it should hold up the project. I think if that information is available before the final revised application is completed, and certainly probably before FSEC's final DIS is issued, then it could be considered. That's a pretty short time frame for taking raw data to a sort of a even a kind of peer reviewed or WFW reviewed standard.
And I don't want to get too far in the weeds of SEPA because that's not what we're here to talk about today. But trying to understand from a scientific perspective, there's data here about use of the area, maybe not compiled in the same way that Mr. Jansen compiled the use of the Frugious Hawk, surveys of the Frugious Hawk, but certainly these are not just surveys, but GPS collar data that has happened. And so professionally, can FSEC understand the project's impacts on the species if they don't do further analysis? And what I'm getting at is, my follow-up question, just to view, can they do it now? And if they defer it to the technical advisory committee, is that going to provide a robust scientific analysis of the project's impacts?
Again, keeping this separate from the SEPA process, I can't really speak to what FSEC may or may not do related to that. I think from my perspective, thinking about the application and how we think about it from the habitat mitigation planning perspective, again, I don't think incorporating that data in its current form or in a future kind of analyzed form would change the conclusions that we've currently come to in our application. Whether FSEC, is satisfied with that or not is the question for them, frankly. I do, yeah. So I guess, and maybe just to expand a little bit, I guess in my view, this is a really good example. In my view, the role of the technical advisory committee, in part, it's to hold the project accountable and to come up with ideas for how to continue to minimize impacts on resources. But also it's sort of a backstop against uncertainty. Like there's always going to be some level of uncertainty with all of the things that we're talking about here, pronghorn and otherwise. And we won't have we won't have all the answers to all the questions by the time, if the project moves forward, we won't have all the questions answered by that time. And so the technical advisory committee, being seated for the life of the project is really intended to help manage that uncertainty during project operations. And I think Pronghorn falls into that category.
And the mitigation plan that you co-authored does discuss the technical advisory committee, and it also references the 2009 wind power guidelines, which, rather than bring it up, I'll just represent, unless you disagree with me, that those guidelines recommend that the technical advisory committee truly only be advising on the impacts of post-construction monitoring, correct?
That's how it's, I would say, defined in the wind power guidelines. Yes.
Okay. To the best of your knowledge, what happens if a disagreement occurs or there's a disconnect between a recommendation by the technical advisory committee and the economic or commercial interests of the project developer?
I would say two things. One is that when any good technical advisory committee, as they sort of put a charter together, they have a framework for that. How do you facilitate disagreements within the group? So I think that would be, they would handle that themselves at first. And then ultimately, FSEC is the decision maker. And as was stated yesterday, it's FSEC's job to make sure that the terms and conditions of the site certificate are held up. And so the TAC is an advisory committee to both the applicant and to FSEC in that way. But I think if there's a disagreement within the TAC, ultimately sort of the buck stops with FSEC.
And am I right in summarizing your findings or opinions that there does not need to be mitigation for impacts of pronghorn because you do not believe that there will be impacts of pronghorn from the project?
I don't think that's exactly right. I would say we didn't address pronghorn in the habitat mitigation plan because and this isn't exactly the answer you're going to want to hear, Ms. Walkers. I apologize. It's not a species that was on recommended for analysis by Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife during the process. FSEC didn't bring it up until that November meeting that we referenced earlier today. And since then, there has been more emphasis on that species in the many ways we've talked about. It's not a priority species. It's a game species managed by the Yakama Nation. So as I mentioned, you mentioned, should treaty protected species be treated in the same way as some of these other species? I think this is an example where there's not overlap between a treaty protected species and the regulatory framework that we're operating within here. And so, anything in addition that would need to be done or should be done for pronghorn would, I think, probably have to be done sort of even outside of this process.
I'm going to ask it a similar question because I'm still trying to understand. Is the pronghorn's exclusion from mitigation measures for the project's impacts because it's not a priority and for the applicant, or because it's not something that's considered by you and other scientists to be something that would require mitigation?
I would certainly, again, can't really speak for the applicant. I wouldn't say it's not a priority for the applicant. You'd have to ask them that question. For me as a biologist, I think, right now, the state of this particular pronghorn population, it's a reintroduced population, which is doing well, as you pointed out. It seems to be growing, which is great. But it is just that it's a reintroduced population that's managed by Yakama Nation. There are no other requirements within the regulatory framework that we're operating in to provide mitigation for the species, and that's why it's not included.
is it your scientific opinion that the project will have impacts on the pronghorn?
I would say yes, that certainly they won't have access to the areas that are fenced off as solar arrays, which we've talked about. And whether or not they are influenced by the wind turbines, that's a little bit up in the air, frankly. We've seen, if you look at the literature, in some cases, pronghorn, and again, places like Wyoming, primarily where these studies have been done, sometimes they avoid wind facilities, sometimes they are, walking right through them. So it sort of remains to be seen what happens here. And I think, again, that could be something that the TAC is interested in and may want to take up in their proceedings.
So understanding there's no mitigation proposed for the pronghorn at this point, if the project were to move forward and the technical advisory did determine that there were impacts that on the pronghorn that are trying to use this area, have you ever heard of any developers removing wind turbines due to monitoring of impacts?
No, I think at that point, I have not. I can elaborate if you'd like.
No, that's okay. I think we're trying to get to the lunch hour
Yeah.
here. Have you ever heard of any solar farms being required or requested to modify their solar arrays due to impacts that were identified by a technical advisory committee?
No, but I think there are other means of mitigation that could be employed.
So what happens in your mind if there are negative impacts to the pronghorn that are detected after the project is constructed?
I'm sorry, could you say the first part of that again?
Like, what do you expect to happen given your experience and being a significant contributor, I think you said earlier, to this mitigation plan, as well as the technical advisory committee? What is the plan, I guess? If we're not doing more analysis on the front end for the project's impacts, what happens then if the project is constructed as designed and there are impacts to the species?
I think, again, not to necessarily try to get ahead of the technical advisory committee on that, but if my thought is if the technical advisory committee was going to, engage on the with the accommodation on pronghorn, there could be some, some continued analysis of what we know about the baseline situation, and that's the data we've talked about, and then how that might change, how the use of the area by the species might change over time. And if there is an effect that is measurable, I think the options there, you're right, it probably wouldn't be removal of infrastructure, but it would be something more in the line of providing additional mitigation down the line, similar to what you might find for other species, if there are effects that are, higher than were anticipated. So.
And is it fair to say that the pronghorn, given their characteristics as a species, as well as development in Eastern Washington, is already constricted in certain ways in their movement around the landscape even before this project is constructed?
Yeah, heavily constricted. If the Arid Lands Initiative, which you have referenced in a couple of cases, the modeling that they show in the document that you submitted in evidence shows this area as highly constrained. It's not an area that animals can easily move through, even now.
Ms. Volkers, this is Judge Torum. In the interest of time, I know you've taken substantially more time for good reason to go into this witness's testimony. We're scheduled to end for lunch at 12:45, and we do have a strict schedule this afternoon to allow time. How much more time do you need before I come back to Ms. Perlmutter? And then we have the council questions as well.
Thank you, Your Honor. We're on the same page. That is the end of my questions at this time. I did have something that I had hoped to make a statement on this morning. We didn't have time in our housekeeping, so I could make that comment at this point or after lunch, but I am done with my questions at this point for Mr. Romig.
Thank you. Let's hold that other procedural point for us, maybe without council members, for after lunch. Ms. Perlmutter, I'm going to have you do some redirect as needed, and then we'll come back to Chair Drew and council members for their questions.
Can I have 5 minutes, Your Honor?
Sure, let's come back at 12:17.
Thank you.
We'll take a brief recess. All right, thank you very much for your patience. I hope we have redirect ready to go, Ms. Perlmutter and Mr. Romick.
I think so, Your Honor. I'll do my best. Mr. Romick, we talked a bit about technical advisory committees. Can you tell me who makes up a technical advisory committee?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's certainly, there's not a one size fits all, but typically what we see with technical advisory committees are, all of the relevant state resource agencies, Department of Ecology, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, Department of Natural Resources, probably maybe others I'm forgetting off the top of my head. And then it can, kind of beyond that, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service may be involved in some cases. And then beyond that, it can get somewhat expansive, include, local interest groups, other stakeholders, other resource experts. And I think increasingly what we're seeing, or the way we're thinking about technical advisory committees, is whereas in the past they've been very focused on, like themes like wildlife resources, for example, as we've been talking about the last couple of days, but there's a lot of other things that occur relative to a project site and the operation of a project site. Things like just revegetation, for example, is a big topic that people are concerned about now. So having revegetation experts on a technical advisory committee would be very helpful, for example. So it can be a wide variety of people.
Does the applicant have representation on the technical advisory committee?
I don't actually know the answer to that. They're informed by or advised by the technical advisory committee, so they're certainly present when the committee meets. Depending on how the charter is drawn up for the technical advisory committee, whether or not they would be an actual member or not, I don't know, but they would be involved.
What about the accommodation?
They certainly could be. Yeah.
And do you know, are there any plans for the technical, let me ask, how far advanced are the plans for the technical advisory committee with regard to this particular project?
I would say, they're in their infancy, and that's in part just because of where we are in the process. So typically, kind of by definition, technical advisory committees are formed and begin their work when the project begins operations. And then, as we've stated, they're together for the life of the project. So what has happened, though, I would say in the last year and a half or 2 years or something like that, is because of, two things. One is because of, I think, the growing interest in things like frugious hawk in particular, and some other things, birds and bats. We've heard about all of that last couple of days. And the uncertainty that we're carrying into the as the project advances, there is, I would say, growing interest from all parties to know more about this mysterious technical advisory committee. Who are they? What are they going to do? And so we have made some attempts to begin to put a little bit of a structure together. And at this stage, I would say it's like recommendations, really. Like it's really up to FSEC and the technical advisory committee and the applicant to form the group and figure that out. But some of the things we have done, for example, have been just to think about who might be members of that group, and I listed some of them already, and then began to think about, as we are managing uncertainty and managing for these what will be really rare events. Like, for example, if we do have a frugious hawk fatality on this project, which I think would be an exceedingly rare event based on what we know about the species in the project area, what would the technical advisory committee do in that case? And so we've, started kind of sketching out what that process might look like. And again, the technical advisory committee itself might come up with their own, and they probably will come up with their own process, but we're trying to create some certainty for people who have concerns about, leaving so much sort of power at the hands of the technical advisory committee.
Understood. And you said stakeholders are generally invited or will generally participate.
They can be, yeah. If interested, it's I guess from my perspective, like, it always sounds great to be on a technical advisory committee, but it is work. And so there would be, I think, outreach to, particularly local stakeholders that have expressed some interest. And if they want to join and stick with it for the duration of the project, that would be great.
Thanks. There's been some discussion about this. This is specifically with regard to pronghorns. The difference between about two different, it seems like two different data sources. The summary reports, the winter summary reports, and also telemetry data. Could you just explain what the difference is between those two things?
Yeah, the summary reports, which we reference in the application, and which are available on the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife website. Those are reports. The work there was attempts to do surveys during the winter months when pronghorn are typically grouped up to count the animals. It's really a kind of a population survey to figure out how many pronghorn are out on the landscape. So some of the numbers that Ms. Volkers and I were looking at earlier were related to that. And then the telemetry data, and so that's a winter time survey. The telemetry data is, essentially you put a GPS collar on an animal and it travels around the landscape, and you take locations of that animal over a certain period of time at certain frequencies, and you can kind of see where it spends its time. And so that data is not limited to winter, that's year round. So that's the primary difference.
And do we have all of the telemetry data for the pronghorn as regards to this project?
I don't know the answer to that question. We received telemetry data from Yakima Nation, two different rounds, and data sets were slightly different. We haven't spent a lot of our time kind of looking at kind of quality control, quality assurance of that data at this point. I don't know if there's more. I can't really speak to that, but we have received some, yes.
Okay. But you can't say definitively that we have everything that's out there.
No.
Yes, you cannot say that definitively.
Yeah, no, yes, correct, yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
And we talked about curtailment as sort of a general context, or a general concept. What does curtailment mean with regard to this project, with regard to bats specifically?
Curtailment is essentially just modifying the operations of the turbine. So typically that means turning off the turbines during certain time periods in order to minimize the potential for species to be struck by turbine blades. So that's basically what curtailment is.
And is that the best approach when it comes to bats?
It's probably certainly the most widely used approach right now. There are a lot of, here's this word again, there are a lot of emerging technologies. There are a lot of new things. So just speaking about bats for a second, I mean, bats are on the minds of the wind industry in particular, because in the past there have been a couple of species in the Midwest and East that were federally listed, and there are increasing numbers of species that are getting federally listed, primarily because of impacts from white nose syndrome, and among other things. And so wind industry is keenly aware of this issue with bats and how they interact with wind turbines. So there's been a lot of investment on solutions to that problem. So curtailment's one of them. There's been some recent work on deterrent. So basically devices that emit, sounds in the same kind of relative frequency range of bat species to deter them from the area where there are turbines. That's, again, really in its infancy. There have been some projects that are using it, and there's some studies that have come out showing some I would say some showing success, some maybe not so much. So the jury is a little bit out, but it's a tool in the toolbox. And I have no doubt that there will be other things that that come to pass in the future. Again, this is bat interactions with wind facilities is something the industry is keenly focused on.
Is it something you've been focused on?
It has, yeah.
And this is a hard question this is a difficult question to phrase, but when you talk about an emerging technology such as deterrence, what would you expect the time frame for a technology like that to be before it comes online? In other words, we're sitting here in August of 2023, you're talking about an emerging technology. When would you think that that deterrence would be suitable for utilization in a project like this?
I mean, the acoustic deterrents are being deployed on projects right now. Mostly it's being done in an experimental fashion to figure out, is it working? And if not, making adjustments sort of in a research capacity. So I would say it's available now. It will certainly be refined, probably pretty heavily refined in the next 3 to 5 years as the data come in from the research projects that are ongoing or underway. So I guess that's what I would say.
Are there other approaches in development as well?
I'm sure there are, not that I'm aware of offhand, but every time I go to another research conference, there's somebody has a new idea. So yeah.
Have you thought about giant scarecrow? Never mind. Okay. You stated, sorry, you stated this was talking about, again, pronghorn in the area of the site. And you said that, and the question was with regard to the Moon memo and the modifications that were being made to the to the proposed project. You said that you said right now the only proposed modification is to the eastern solar field. You said based on the data, there's no benefit to further modification. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit? What did you mean?
Yeah, I think at the time I was being asked about data that were being shown on the screen, and based on that information, I'm not sure I said exactly that, Ms. Perlmutter. I think what I was attempting to state, and I am walking a little bit behind here on the data thing, was that reduction of the East Solar Array, according to the data that we saw on that particular screen, didn't seem to be benefiting the species because there were no GPS locations within that array, whereas there were in others. I think what you said was there would be no benefits from further modification. I think, as I mentioned when I was speaking with Ms. Volker, I think any reduction, whether that be shrinking of solar arrays or removal of turbines, any reduction is a reduction. So I think there is benefit to all of those reductions to pronghorn and other species.
And you said that the reduction to the total fenced area will be a general benefit? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think with respect to pronghorn, and this was stated in not just in my testimony, but in Mr. Gunwellis and others, I think there's the areas of most concern are those areas that are going to be the solar arrays because they are fenced for security purposes. And so those areas are inherently not available to large species like pronghorn. They are available to small species that can move under the fence and through the fence, but not to pronghorn. And so, yeah, so any reduction of the fenced area would be a net benefit to a species like pronghorn.
Are you able to express an opinion as to what the impact of the fences as the project is currently designed, how much of an impact they would have?
Well, I would characterize that as it relates to habitat for the pronghorn, and inside of the solar arrays, the fenced solar areas, even before the east solar reduction that's discussed in the Moon memo, we're talking about areas that are, I think it was like 85% agricultural lands, which are low quality habitat for pronghorn. They do use it. There's evidence of that, and Ms. Wilkers and I talked about that. But it's not their preferred habitat. It's low quality habitat for pronghorn. With the east solar reduction that we've talked about, that the percentage of the solar areas that will be in agriculture is even higher because the part of East Solar that is gone away was a portion that included some priority habitats like rabbit brush shrubland, for example, that could be more readily utilized by pronghorn. So it's an impact because there's a portion of the land that's fenced and pronghorn can't go there. But we're talking about low quality habitat for the species, so I would say it's a minimal impact at best.
Okay. And there was some actually, frankly, interesting talk about treaty protective species and priority species. And I think I understand the distinction between those. But you also said that the pronghorn was not a priority species. It was a game species managed by the Yakama Nation. Do you remember that?
Correct.
What is a game species?
A game species, I guess, most simply is a species that could be hunted. So mule deer would be an example, ringneck pheasants, other things that are managed by Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife as game species.
So are pronghorn then a game species?
They certainly are throughout the West. I'm actually not certain of their status as a game species. I believe they are considered a game species in Washington, but as a reintroduced herd managed by the Yakama Nation, I'm not sure. I actually don't know if hunts actually occur, for example.
And in response, you said there were a pair of questions from Ms. Volkers about whether you had ever heard of developers removing turbines based on the recommendation of a technical advisory committee. And it was clear you wanted to say more, but we moved on. So could you expand on your answer there?
Yeah, I think simply, and I got around to it, I think, a little bit with Ms. Volkers as well. I think that the technical advisory committee, as they're thinking about, as they're looking at information coming in and potential effects, from monitoring that's going on during project operations, if they got to a point, and again, they would probably, my recommendation to them, future them, would be to predetermine what those thresholds are, right? So they're not making it up as they go. They basically say, like, if we set a threshold, if we see a particular effect, whether it be with pronghorn or birds and bats or whatever it is, and the project goes over that threshold, then something needs to happen. And Ms. Volkers noted that, correctly noted that you never see a project, you never remove a turbine, you don't remove a highway, you don't remove a building, right? And so what I was going to elaborate on there was just that there are other things that can be done. So, other forms of mitigation that the TAC could potentially recommend that the applicant and FSEC do, whether that be sort of traditional setting aside land, or funding of things, and so on and so forth. So there are other things that could benefit pronghorn besides just removing infrastructure.
And is the same true? Would your answer be the same if I were to ask you about the removal of solar arrays?
Correct.
Okay. Your Honor, if I could just take 1 minute to caucus with my colleagues, I think we're good.
All right, and I'll ask council members to start putting their hands up with questions they may have while Ms. Perlmutter speaks to her colleagues.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
All right, Mr. Livingston, I think, had his hand up first, and there may be another behind.
Thank you, Your Honor. I'm Mr. Remeg. I imagine you're getting as hungry as I am, so I might.
Indeed.
I'll try to make my question short, but it's important topics. First, I was going to say that I'm a bit intrigued by how much discussion we're having around the technical advisory committee, given I feel like it's a reactive, adaptive approach when right now we're talking about trying to avoid and minimize the impacts of the siting. Could you agree to that?
Yes, I agree.
Yeah. So that's all I really wanted to say about TAC. It just seems like we need to really focus on trying to avoid and minimize here. On the pronghorn discussion, I just wanted to say for the record, WDFW does regulate and has regulatory authority over pronghorn off the Yakima Reservation. It is classified as a game species, but because of its low numbers, we don't have a hunting season established in Washington. So just so that everybody's aware of that. For example, if somebody was caught harvesting a pronghorn, they would be subject to all the applicable laws that protect them. And because it's not a species in season, they would be subject to those laws. So just want to make that clear. In addition to that, we do manage them in the sense that we do cooperative surveys with the Yakima Nation, and we are, engaged in processes like this to protect habitat for them and also protect the animals themselves. Specifically on the biology of pronghorn, I think you touched on this with Ms. Volkers. Do they avoid overhead structures? A lot of these species that inhabit open prairies tend to not live in environments with vertical structures. So what do we know about wind turbines in particular in pronghorn?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you're right about that. It's pretty mixed actually, and again, nearly all of that work that has been done on pronghorn and other, mule deer and other species are in places like Wyoming. Some of that stems from kind of legacy work on oil and gas infrastructure, and then has sort of segued into renewable energy infrastructure, and so the body of literature kind of encompasses all of those things. And there are instances that have been documented where, and again, just to point out the distinction for people, in Wyoming and places like with pronghorn in Wyoming, those are animals that are moving. They have a pretty mass migration. They move a long distance, different than the reintroduced population we're talking about here. Yep. But they, in some instances, they have been shown to avoid facilities like a wind facility. And as I noted, in other instances, they have been documented, walking right through it. So I would say I don't think there's any definitive answer to that question. And as I was mentioning with Ms. Volkers, I think because of that, first of all, it's whether we can extrapolate information from those studies to this location. I sort of take that with a little bit of a grain of salt, just because of the differences in the ecology of the species. Frankly, even though it's the same species, we may not know. We probably won't know, unless the project moves forward and there's some kind of follow up, monitoring of that, how it will affect the species.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to switch to habitat use a little bit. So, Washington pronghorn, the ones we're talking about in Benton County, Yakima County, Klickitat County, use the dryland wheat fields for travel corridors, right?
They seem to. I mean, and my answer is mostly based on the data that I've seen from Yakima Nation, and I think any animals that are within the project area are, at some point gonna walk across an agricultural field, because it's mostly ag land. Yeah.
And the Horse Heaven Hills landscape's really fragmented as far as wildlife habitat goes. I think I heard you say that.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah. The pronghorn, though, are still traveling across that fragmented landscape to get to these more, native habitat types, shrub steppe, grasslands. Right.
Yeah, it's, I don't actually know about that, just based on the physical nature of the portion of Horse Heaven Hills we're talking about here. There, if you, one of the well, I'm not going to stray into this, but the data that I've seen, and that I think all of us have probably seen, if you look at the number of pronghorn locations on the Yakima Nation reservation itself, where the reintroduction has occurred, I mean, there's heavy use on the reservation, which makes sense because that's where they have been reintroduced over time. And it seems that there is occasional use in the project area, but there's it's kind of a dead end for them. So because of the way the river wraps around, and the development on the north of the Tri-Cities, the irrigated ag on the south, so they're utilizing the project area in some way. It's not clear to me if they're traversing it to get to better habitat, for example, or exactly what they're doing in there, because it is so fragmented.
Yeah, I guess what I was getting at is that there's patches of more native habitat in amongst the active wheat fields, whether they're growing wheat currently or in fallow stage. But they're actually able to traverse that landscape. The resistance level there seems to be, though it's modeled, it would probably not be super good for them, but they managed, they're figuring it out.
They're figuring
to
it out,
persist
yes.
out there. Yeah.
Yeah, and you're right, the
Um,
modeling from Air Land Initiative shows it as a very dark blue. In other words, a very a high cost to species to move through that area. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and you mentioned that, and you just did too, the Yakima Reservation's more core habitat because there's more natural vegetation, and they were originally released there with these different translocation activities that the Yakima Nation has taken care of, right?
Correct.
It's interesting, and I used to live in Prosser. Shortly after they released those, I mean, really within a week, several moved eastward. And this is common. Wildlife do this when we move them from their home ground to a new novel environment. They disperse. Some stayed on the reservation, some went south, some went east. The interesting thing, though, is that some of those moved there and they've remained there. And now I don't know if there's any original animals, but there's certainly the progeny of those. And they've been there in that area for, I think, since 2009, I believe was the first release. So about 14 years they've been occupying that area. So given that, would you consider those areas where that subset of these pronghorn that we have here as core habitat for them?
I don't know. I think I'd have to think a little bit more about the definition of core habitat and what that means. I mean, certainly if you have an area that's getting repeated use, year after year, you have a population, individuals or groups of individuals that are not moving and they're there through the whole year. I guess I would say at some point in time it becomes core habitat. In other words, it's fulfilling all of their life history needs. They're not moving in and out. So I would probably agree with that, but I would have to think a little more about the definition of core habitat for this population.
Okay. Yeah, I appreciate that. And maybe there's a better term for it, but they're resident. There's a resident.
There you go.
Subpopulation that have meeting all of their life history needs year after year for up to 14 years now. So get something you kind of painted a bleak picture for pronghorn in the Horseheaven Hills in your rebuttal to Mr. Guanellis's testimony. And yet, it's like we were talking, I find it interesting because I think the animals are teaching us something about their habitat needs because they've been occupying that area for some time now. Could you say they're doing well in that fragmented habitat in the Horseheaven Hills?
Well, they certainly seem, the population numbers are going up or now at least kind of remaining stable. I think over time, and in the bleak picture I painted, frankly, was, drawn from the previous attempts to reintroduce the species over time that didn't work. Some of the analysis that was done on if we were going to reintroduce the species, where would we do it? Where Horseheaven was not even a consideration. And then thinking about the needs of a species like pronghorn, particularly the need for them to move around, as we've been discussing, and looking at what like Air Lands Initiative, for example, what their modeling shows about this area, and that it's like not very hospitable for a species like pronghorn. I was sort of triangulating that information when I painted that bleak picture. That's not to say that they won't persist there, for sure. At what level, it's hard to say. I'm sure at some point they will reach a carrying capacity if they're limited, to sort of the Yakima Indian Reservation and the extent of the project area, again, with the physical constraints that they have to navigate there relative to development, the river and the highways and irrigated ag. So yeah, I think they're persisting and hopefully the population continues to increase, frankly. I think history tells us that it'll be challenging.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm not 100% familiar with past efforts. It was decades ago.
Yeah.
I do know that topography is one of they're a visual species. That's how they avoid predators. And so they need vast open, which, you know, actually the Horse Heaven Hills has that aspect. And I suspect the lack of habitat quality is made up for just the vastness of that landscape. It's pretty big and wide open. And so you know, they seem to be able to travel across and live in this fragmented habitat, receive, you know, find their food, their water. So it seems like any additional fragmentation, whether it's roads, fences, is gonna, you know, make it more challenging, more resistance going to be added to the landscape for them to travel in between, you know, these higher quality places that they're probably finding their forage. Would you agree with that?
I would agree.
And I assume that one of the factors that the study that we did several years ago for reintroduction feasibility study was well, let me back up a little bit. The reason that Horse Heaven Hills wasn't even considered is because it's a large private landscape. And typically when we look to reintroduce wildlife, we're looking for protected landscapes where there's assurances that we have control over that habitat. And so that, you know, that could be a factor likely.
Fair. Yeah, that's fair.
All right. I guess I'll just, you know, the last thing on the pronghorn is that, so they've been there for 14 years since they've been reintroduced. And can you explain why they haven't returned to the reservation if the habitat is bleak and unsuitable?
I'm sorry. Oh, are you saying why they're becoming resident, like you mentioned in the process? Okay. Yeah, I think I would say, first of all, some of the data that Yakima Nation has been collecting, the telemetry data, I think could actually help answer some of those questions. If they are in fact a resident population, or if they are moving back and forth, for example, we could learn more about the dynamics there, or how they're using the more fragmented landscape within the project area. I think that there's probably information that could be gleaned from the telemetry data that would help us answer that question. But presumably, I mean, if they are, like I said, meeting all their life history needs over the course of the year, you know, animals aren't going to move just for fun, you know, like they'll move if they have to. But if they have, you know, food, shelter, and the ability to reproduce, they're probably going to stay where they are. So.
Moving off of pronghorn, and I just got a few more. I wanted to ask a question about Townsend's ground squirrels. So they're a state candidate species. They're really difficult to survey and to monitor their population status. And some years they're really abundant, and other years they just seem to disappear and you can hardly find them. So without disclosing specific locations to protect sensitive data, there are some colonies within the footprint of the project area, right?
There are, again, going back to, and we've seen this map a couple of times throughout the last couple of days, but going back to the Washington Wildlife Connectivity Working Group and the Arid Lands Initiative work that's been done. So there are some modeled habitat concentration areas for Townsend's ground squirrel within the project area. And so, and then beyond that, there are probably certainly active colonies. We don't have any, you know, current accounting of where those colonies are. So we were using that modeled information and a little bit of just habitat assessment, habitat types, for example, as the basis for our assessment on that species, knowing that there would have to be some pre-construction survey work done. You know, when the kind of the final project plans are complete and the final micrositing is happening, there would have to be some pre-construction survey work done for a species like Townsend's ground squirrel to make sure that we were really minimizing effects. Yeah.
So the ground squirrels are a preferred food for ferruginous hawks. In fact, ferruginous hawks used to be called the squirrel hawk, formerly in the common name. How do we So in those designs for turbines, how do we avoid them end up, so frugious hawks foraging for ground squirrels in the danger zone of a turbine? What's been done, what's proposed to prevent that from happening? Because that seems to me to be a very significant concern as far as attracting this state endangered species to their preferred food.
Yeah, I think that this is sort of something that wind facilities contend with across the country with respect to raptor interactions with facilities and minimizing attractants. With Townsend's ground squirrel in particular, it is a preferred food, but it is also a very rare species. It's a state candidate species, as you mentioned. So it's not like they're running all over the place. There are certainly some colonies, I would imagine, inside of the project area. And I think attempts to, avoid and minimize those colonies are helpful for the Townsend's ground squirrel, as a candidate species. But they will then persist on the landscape and remain, potentially unattractive for raptors, including frugious hawks. I think that there's, there are other attractants out there for hawks as well, right? There's pocket gophers and myriad, rabbits, jackrabbits, and other rabbits that are also food resources for the species, probably much more abundant than like, the Townsend's ground squirrel, for example. So I guess in terms of minimizing attractants, it's a bigger question than just Townsend's ground squirrel, in my opinion. And, going back really to square one on the whole thing, I think the biggest thing that can be done by a project is to make sure that it is sited well. I know there are others in these proceedings that would disagree with my wildlife opinion on this, but siting the project in agricultural lands is one of the best ways that we can minimize attractants for things like frugious hawks, because there are while there are things like pocket gophers and Townsend's ground squirrels that persist around the edges of ag fields, they don't routinely persist, for better or worse, in ag fields. So this project is, 85 to 90% in ag land. And in doing so, in that siting, it has gone a long way to minimizing the attractants and minimizing the risk to the species.
Okay. Well, thank you for your time, and
thank you.
I'm done.
Mr. Livingston, particularly cruel of you to ask predation and feeding questions before lunch, but I'm going to go to Mr. Levitt.
Hi, Mr. Romig. My name is Eli Levitt. I'm Ecology's representative to FSAC. Just have two very fast questions, I hope. So it sounds like you have substantial experience modeling, doing quantitative analysis, qualitative analysis, and field analysis or field work for protected species like the bats and the hawks in particular. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay, so given all this professional experience, I'm trying to lift us up to more like the 20,000 or 30,000 foot level. What are the biggest stressors? So top 2 or 3 for this hawk species and for the sensitive bat species. So by stressors, I mean quality of habitat fragmentation, habitat connectivity, changing conditions in the future, like increased wildfire, availability of prey, those sorts of things. What would you estimate the top stressors are for those two groups?
Yeah, for frugious hawk and really hawks in general, I would say habitat loss. And many of the things you listed can result in habitat loss, various types of development, wildfire, et cetera. That all sort of falls under the umbrella of habitat loss, in my view. That includes breeding and foraging habitat, of course. For bats, I think it's a little more complicated. I think for bats, not yet in Washington, but coming. We've seen some instances of it, but white nose syndrome, which is a virus on bats, it's like the giant elephant in the room, right? It's really having big impacts on bat populations around the country. And then second to that, and this is documented, in the listing of bat species white nose syndrome is sort of up here. And then under that are things like habitat loss, fatalities from wind projects, fatalities from other forms of, cars and buildings and so forth. But I think that's, we spend a lot of time, I mentioned this, the industry's really focused on bats right now. We spend a lot of time on the species. Unfortunately, if we don't solve white nose syndrome, that'll be all for naught. I mean, that's the major stressor on the population. And then the bats that we've been really talking about here, Ms. Reinveld brought up, for example, the hoary bats and silverhead bats. I mean, they're migratory species. So while we are, we're working on and thinking about them in their, spring and summer, where they are in the spring and summer, they spend the rest of their year somewhere else. And there's inherently, there's a whole host of stressors. I mentioned the ones, but also just, not to get too esoteric, but I mean, just like the, continued kind of monocrop agriculture and pesticides and reduction of they love to eat mosquitoes and people hate mosquitoes. So that can be a big stressor in certain areas as well. So yeah, sorry, that was probably longer than you wanted.
No, thank you. That's great. That's it.
All right, council members and parties. I am going to propose a curtailment action of my own so we can take lunch until 2 o'clock. Mr. Romig, if you'll stay available and be back at 2 o'clock, I'm going to make sure if the parties want to go back to the Jeopardy board up here and try wildlife impacts for 600, I'll allow Ms. Perlmutter and the other parties to do that. I'm hoping we've exhausted the questions we have for you, but in fairness, I have to go back around the round robin one more time. We'll do that at 2 o'clock. Will be followed by Leslie McLean's testimony, which is the last witness for today. And we'll have the applicant explain why she's testifying again today and the different scope of her testimony at that time. So we're going to curtail questions now, take the lunch break, and we'll be back at 2 o'clock. Thank you.
Mr. Torm may be heard on one matter.
After lunch. Thank you.
Okay, I'll be ready at 2 o'clock. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to take that slide down and continue with our hearing this afternoon. I've been made aware there are some other issues for housekeeping for the parties for tonight's public comment hearing. We're going to take those up after testimony today. All right, Mr. Romig, I can see you're back with us, and I'm just going to do a quick survey of participants. We have a couple open mics. We'll see what we can do to take the echo out. All right, hopefully that's better. Thank you all for finding the microphone discipline buttons. Yeah, it looks like everybody's back. Ms. Perlmutter, did you have any follow-up questions after the council questions we had from Mr. Romig?
Yes, I do, Your Honor.
All right.
Hello again, Mr. Romig.
Hello.
Mr. Livingston asked you about the Technical Advisory Committee, and specifically, he pointed out that Technical Advisory Committee, by definition, takes a reactive approach. Do you see any benefit to that?
I do. I mean, I think that is correct. It is a reactive approach. It's, reacting to new information that's coming in through monitoring activities that are happening during operation. And I think that it's in reaction to changes in whatever, I guess maybe sort of changes in how that information is being taken in and evaluated, rare occurrences. We've been talking about Frisian hawk fatality. That would be a rare occurrence that the TAC would react to. So yeah, I think it's reactionary, and I think it has to be at that point in time, and I think that's a good thing.
And is that reactionary approach to the exclusion, or does that mean you don't have to worry about the avoidance and the minimizing that Mr. Livingston also referenced?
No, it's both. You do both. So I mean, I think the certainly before we ever get to the reactive piece that the TAC is doing, again, assuming the project moves forward, the facility is built, and there's a technical advisory committee. What we're doing now is it is all about avoidance and minimization and mitigation, and I could go into detail about that. I'm sure everyone's tired of hearing me talk today. But that's the avoidance and minimization is outlined in the application. There's additional detail in the habitat mitigation plan about minimization measures specifically for Frugianus hawk that were added in response to concerns by WFW. And then there's a mitigation package proposed in the habitat mitigation plan. So the continuum of avoidance, minimization, and mitigation is all contemplated during this application process. Once we sort of finish, go through the application process and let's just fast forward and say that a site certificate is issued and the project is built. There will still be then some open questions. It's inevitable. We've been talking about bird and bat fatality from the project. We've done everything we can do up front to evaluate what we think that's going to be. And then also as we've been talking about, there have been some modifications to the project that are reducing those impacts now, minimizing, which is good. But we won't really know what those are until the project is operating. And so at that point in time, that's when the TAC reaction will come into play, perhaps if the impacts are greater than expected, for example. So
I have nothing further.
All right, thank you. Ms. Volkers, did that raise any other questions for you? And then I'll ask Ms. Reineveld.
No additional questions, Your Honor.
Ms. Reineveld?
No additional questions, Your Honor. Thank you.
Did any other parties have questions for Mr. Ramig before we let him go? Lenny Young.
Mr. Ramig, mid-morning, there was some dialogue back and forth about best available science definitions and such. Are you aware of any concerns that have been raised as to whether any of the information, scientific information that has been introduced into this proceeding in any way is not best available science?
I would say I would think very carefully about that. I think the available part is the hard one for me. And what I mean by that is, some of the information that has been inserted into these proceedings is, we've had to sign, for example, confidentiality agreements to view it, and we've gone into closed session a number of times. So I guess based on that, I'm not sure that actually meets the best available test. It's not to say it's not quality information, it's just maybe doesn't meet the best available test. All of the information that is in the application and that we've been discussing related to that, I think certainly does meet the best available test.
Thank you.
Mr. Livingston?
Yeah, Your Honor, if I just wanted to respond, make sure people are clear that I wasn't saying a technical advisory committee isn't important. It's just timing of our discussion of, the emphasis on technical advisory committee and the reactive mode and adaptive mode, as opposed to what we're trying to do right now in the process, which is avoid impacts as much as possible. So just wanted to clear that up.
I appreciate the differentiation from where we are in the process and what might be going up to the recommendation to the governor, whatever it is, and what might happen later if the project goes forward. Thanks for clarifying. All right, any other questions for Mr. Ramig? All right, Mr. Ramig, thank you.
Thank you.
We're gonna move on to the remaining witness for today, Leslie McLean. I'm gonna see if I can get her on the screen here. And while I'm doing that, I had a question for Ms. Massengale. I know that Ms. McLean's testimony was taken on, I think, Monday last week, and we identified her exhibits as 1023 in sequence all the way to 1030. And then there was a response or rebuttal piece of testimony 1040_R. I didn't on my score sheet indicate whether 1040R had been admitted, and I frankly haven't looked at the most updated exhibit list. So Ms. Massengale, can you confirm that all of Ms. McLean's exhibits were adopted and admitted on Monday last week?
This is Lisa Maskell. One moment, please, Judge Torum.
All right, while you're getting that, Ms. McLean, I can see you there. Thanks very much for being back today. And Mr. McMahon, I think you're sponsoring this witness. Can you remind council members what the scope of her testimony might be today as differentiated from last week's land use pieces?
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you for that. We had to kind of test our memory on how we got here as well. We did present Ms. McLean's testimony about local land use and kind of all things local land use. But there were some questions related to decommissioning and restoration of the facility post-construction that the parties wanted to have further discussion about. And as I recall, Your Honor, I believe it was, I think it was your idea to kind of peel this off into a separate bucket, as it were. It's very much related and it's very much part of the land use testimony, but the consensus seemed to be that we would take this up separately for, I think, a 0.7 hour cross-examination or examination by the county for Ms. McLean. So I want to just test my memory against yours, Judge Torm, and others. I think that's the idea. And then I can cite to the portions of the testimony that I think implicate these issues.
All right, well, the early Alzheimer's stuff is setting in for me, as you might guess, at this point of the proceeding. So I'm going to ask Mr. Harper to do the sanity check for us as to Ms. McLean's recall and his intended cross-exam.
Well, Your Honor, I don't actually have any cross-examination on Ms. McLean beyond what we've already addressed.
All right, so that may shorten up our afternoon a little bit here. Do other parties have questions outside of what was already asked on Monday about sort of the back end of the project and any other impacts? And maybe, Mr. McMahon, if you cite to the parts of the testimony that
Sure.
perhaps were segregated out from the conditional use permit questions, that'll help jog everybody's memory.
Well, Your Honor, I don't even know they were segregated out per se. And again, I think there's just a lot of confusion about this issue of restoration as kind of being separate from or part of the original land use testimony, because it is in fact addressed in the rebuttal testimony of McLean. And so I will just, let me see if I can pull this up. This is exhibit.
This 1040R, and I think I've got confirmation that was adopted and admitted last week. What I'm
Actually,
seeing in it.
Sorry, Your Honor, it's text 10. Sorry, Your Honor, go ahead.
1040R, did you have a different one?
It actually is really about 1023R, which is the rebuttal testimony of McLean.
Okay, sorry, I had skipped to the reply or whatever the last part was.
Right.
What were you going to summarize out of that one that might be
Yes.
kind of this decommissioning piece here?
Yeah, and it was really, frankly, there's a difference between decommissioning and restoration, and the testimony was more about restoration, because I couldn't say that Ms. McLean is an expert in the financials or whatever of decommissioning. It tends to be an FSEC issue. But so just to narrow this down. So on page 12, starting line 11, and I'll let you get there.
Yeah, I'm bringing it up here. All right, I think I'm there with you.
All right. So the sentence that begins, as described in section 4.2 of the ASC, upon decommissioning of the project, the applicant will replace topsoil and reseed areas where facilities were located with grasses and or other vegetation reasonably acceptable to the landowner. And then there was another piece on page 18, line 19 or 20, I think, to the bottom of that page, that also deals with decommissioning. But again, I just wanted to make clear that decommissioning within this context really had to do with restoration of the land, the topsoil, and the capability for ongoing agricultural use.
Okay.
But and I want to also say this: unless the county has something to offer, we don't. We were just attempting to make sure that we were fully inclusive of the concerns that were raised. This was kind of initially a question from Mr. Harper on behalf of the county. So we're all happy to move on with our day and not handle this any further unless somebody thinks this should be handled and Ms. McLean is here.
Okay. I appreciate that clarification. I'm sure this, when we broke it out for the initial schedule, seemed like a good idea at the time, but it may be overcome by events, as so much is during the course of litigation. Do any parties have follow-up questions for Ms. McLean? She's available today. We've had a little bit of discussion just on our rebuttal testimony from Mr. Wiley and Ms. Cook today on some of the soil characteristics. So perhaps this dovetails well as an opportunity to follow up on any of those areas as Mr. McMahon identified. And I don't know if Counsel for the Environment or Ms. Volkers, even though you weren't listed on these topics, if anything came up today that might be there, and that goes for Mr. Aramburu as well. Ms. McLean, it's nice to see you again, but I think it's going to be a very quick visit. Council members, any questions that you might want to pose in this regard? Mr. Levitt?
Well, thank you
No?
all. And I would say, sorry. I was just going to appreciate Mr. Harper's professionalism yet again on this. We were trying to ascertain what was the best approach, and as always, Ken, I appreciate your reflection.
Happy to keep it moving.
All right. Thank you very much, Ms. McLean, for being here. Chair Drew was kind enough to send me the question she has for Mr. Click, and we were able to solve the crossing in the winds of technology, which email address it went to. So I can read that to the parties here and Mr. Aramburu as needed. Send it to you and Mr. McMahon, but I'll read it to you now. Chair Drew wanted to know, in Mr. Click's testimony, he indicated a concern about creating optimal wildfire containment lines on a wind farm. And her question was, does he think that gravel roads built within a wind facility could themselves become a fire containment line? And next, is Mr. Click aware of any instances in Washington where firefighting has used a wind facility during fires for that purpose? So again, I think it's the reflection of the gravel road infrastructure within the wind farm understructure to get back and forth to the turbines and other access roads, and how those factor in with fire containment or firefighting efforts. Chair Drew, fair enough? Okay, getting a nod of approval. So Mr. Aramburu and Mr. McMahon. Let me come to Mr. McMahon first, because he would have the cross-exam question and how this goes with firefighting. Mr. McMahon?
Actually, Your Honor, we experienced about 3 minutes of technical problems and were unable to hear much of anything that you said. I have the little warning thing now off of my laptop that says we're maybe not having problems anymore. So I hate to ask you to repeat that, but if you wouldn't mind, appreciate that.
Sure. I'll sum it up, I think, rather than read it verbatim. The question for Mr. Click would have been the effect of operational wildfire containment lines on wind farms. He talked about that in his testimony, and Chair Drew wants to know his opinion on the gravel roads that are built within the facility and how they become a fire containment line, if at all. And if he knows of any such instances in Washington about firefighting skills using the roads or otherwise in the context of wind farms here in Washington. So those would be the questions. Mr. Aramburu, to you.
I'd just like to get that in writing if I can. So I'm a lot of things going on today. So written material, if you could get that to us in writing, we get that to Mr. Click and see if we can get Chair Drew an answer, a response.
All right, I will do that shortly as soon as I can send the next email to folks. So I want to go back to the schedule then and make sure we're clear about where things are going today and tomorrow. Tonight we have the public comment hearing at 5:30. I have some procedural concerns that were raised, council members, with the notice, but I'm not going to take those up with you. I'm going to leave that for the parties to discuss with me. Last count we had for the number of commenters, and Ms. Massengale could chime in if that's gone up. We're continuing to take sign-ups until 5 o'clock tonight, so we have a list. I think it was 33 over the lunch hour. So we'll see if that ticks upward toward 40. My math, done not in public, shows that we have essentially 2.5 hours tonight. And Ms. Massengale's confirming as of noon, we had 33. At that rate, I'm willing to do 2.5 minutes per person so we can accommodate all of them during the time frame. If we get over 40, then I think we'll have to limit it to 2 and 15 or 2 minutes, depending on how the round numbers work out. But that's what you should be expecting tonight, to hear up to 33 people. Ms. Massengale and Ms. Owens have let me know that a few of them have signed up and intend to submit only written comments and not attend tonight. I understand there's a competing event on Fox News, whether that's drawing any attention or not. But for whatever reason, some of them are qualified to comment and will submit their additional comments in writing and not be present tonight. So if you hear me call someone and they're not present, that may be the question and the issue. Tomorrow, we have testimony starting at 9 o'clock, and we'll be looking at visual and other environmental physical impacts. So take a look at the Guthrie and Apostol exhibits, and Mr. Polis as well, and that will take up the bulk of the day. Mr. Aramber was kind enough to tell me they're creating a map that they're going to use as a cross-exam exhibit tomorrow, and we'll see how the displays go. But I think when we put that on the screen, hopefully everything's been good as far as being able to zoom in and share screen. But for the visual effects tomorrow, that's going to be particularly important to think about the size and scale of the monitors you're using to view those exhibits, so we can get the idea of scope and scale of the project, which is a true question and definitely a loud and disputed issue in this matter. So keep that in mind as we're seeing any graphic exhibits tomorrow. And then, believe it or not, that's going to take us to our second to last day. And on Friday, we're still going to be trying to see if we need Mr. Polos to be wrapped up. We're going to have counsel for the environment's witness, Mr. McIver. We're going to see Mr. Kobus, and hopefully Jerry Meninick and Casey McWallahey will have been made available either at some point tomorrow or more likely on Friday. We may have some additional tweaks to the schedule. As you've gathered, we're just doing the best we can to juggle availability and whatever's happening on any given day, but we'll see where we are from that. Ms. Massengale is going to be putting together all of things, exhibits later this afternoon, and hopefully everybody will see all the required and linked testimony there for council members to access. Chair Drew, any questions on where we're going the next 2 days? All right, council members, other than about where to find tomorrow's testimony in the one-stop shop folder, any other questions? Ms. Volkers, a question you want to address while the council members are still with us?
Thank you, Your Honor. I did want to address something while the council members are still with us, if I may be heard.
Sure.
Before we move off of wildlife topics for this adjudication, I want to make a request on behalf of Yakama Nation in the interest of ensuring that the council is properly informed regarding whether or not the project does avoid, minimize, or mitigate impacts to wildlife. We ask that wildlife biologist Mr. Watson and Mr. Fedora be able to appear before the council about their area's expertise. We are not aware of any statute, regulation, or contractual obligation that presents their participation in the adjudication. I understand, since we weren't allowed to call them, that Director Bumpus may disagree, but I would respectfully ask that the council, as the presiding officer, be able to make that determination for themselves.
All right, Ms. Volkers, I'll take that under advisement. I think I've got to rely on Mr. Thompson and Ms. Slocum as legal counsel and work with Ms. Bumpus because of the contractual issues. That's not something I can make a ruling on from here. So we'll take that up again under a housekeeping question, and I'm sure the attorneys general heard your question. It may be helpful for you to send that request in writing to them and copy the other parties and Ms. Bumpus, and then we can get a formal answer to you, and it can be essentially recorded besides what we have in today's session that you've made that formal request. I do believe, again, those depositions of those Fish and Wildlife employees are already in the record, but you're asking for a formal appearance for questioning. Is that right?
Yes, Your Honor, and thank you for the opportunity to clarify. We were not allowed to speak at all with WFW employees, only through those depositions. And we also were not allowed, of course, to call them as witnesses. And my request is that if that is, in fact, the determination of the presiding officer, the council, that we will of course move forward with that understanding. But my request is that the council would take up that issue directly, look at whatever contractual provisions. I know not everyone's seen them, but I have, and I'm just asking that, we're not aware of anything that limits that participation. And so our request is that the council itself as a body consider our request to call them as a witness before this council and ask them directly about the project.
Okay, understood. I'm going to put that into Chair Drew's hands as well as the Attorneys General. And Ms. Reineveld, you had a question on that?
I didn't have a question on that.
You did or did not?
I did not, so it can wait.
Okay, I saw your hand go up. Was there a separate question for the council members while they're here?
It wasn't necessarily for the council members, but I did want to move to admit exhibits from my cross of Mr. Roming's testimony, including 3020 and 3021.
Thank you. That was on my housekeeping notes. I'm glad we'll just do it on the record now. Any objection to those cross-examination exhibits that were used by Counsel for the Environment?
Not at this end, Your Honor.
All right, I'm not seeing any others. So Ms. Massengale will mark 3020 and 3021 as admitted. Council members, I think that's all I need you for today. We'll see you back at 9 o'clock.